All right, so it looks like we're live. Thanks for tuning in to this WaveLab Pro Workflows Google Hangout. It's going to be basically just a live walkthrough of how I use WaveLab Pro. And there's many ways to use WaveLab Pro. It's a very deep program, but I think it's the best program for mastering. Assembling all your master formats, rendering them. It's really geared for the mastering process specifically. And I'm just going to walk you through basically my workflow and explain why I do things a certain way and why I like to use WaveLab. So I'm going to just let things get warmed up here. If anyone has any questions, I'm going to try to keep an eye on them. Harold is helping me out here with fielding any questions, so you can send them directly to me. And if anyone thinks the audio needs to be better or different, please feel free to let us know, and we'll make some adjustments. But I've done some testing, and I think everything is okay. So I see some people trickling in here. I'm going to start out basically by doing my workflow without explaining anything, because I'd like to, in the interest of not boring some people, I like to just show how quickly you can get files in and out of WaveLab and get them processed and ready to go for your clients. So I'm going to do that quickly, not say much, just so you can see how quick it is. And then I'm going to step back and go through some of the WaveLab settings and explain, what things are and where things are, and play around with the layout a little bit, because when you first open WaveLab, it's very busy looking and we can hide some things like that. So Harold tells me that it sounds good, and so I'm going to get rolling. So basically, I'm going to open up WaveLab. So this is basically how I do stuff. Now, in this walkthrough, in this little part of the walkthrough, I'm going to just assume that I've already ran the songs through my analog chain, and they're sounding pretty good. And basically, with this one, I just need to, assemble the songs in the right order, do some data entry, and how that translates to metadata. So basically, I have a folder of, we're going to call this band the WaveLabs, and I have a folder of my captures from analog, and they're still going to need a little bit of work, some final limiting, dithering, maybe a couple per song effects. But basically, I'm going to load these into WaveLab, and this screen lets me pick the song order. So I'm going to look at my handy track sheet. Most of you probably have a project manager of some kind. So I'm just going to make up a song order in the interest of being quick here. And let's say that is the order that I want the songs to be inserted in the montage. I'm going to load them up. I like to save right away. So because of how my folder structures are laid out, it's very easy for me to grab the official band name and the official album title. And I like to call it this. I'm using an app called Copy and Paste, because I use a lot of the same folder names and file naming structures, so I can just use global shortcuts on my Mac. So this is basically where I'm going to listen in, and I've already made it so my files have 200 milliseconds of digital silence at the start of the file and the first note. So I'm basically going to listen through and adjust the song spacing. This song might need to be tapered a little bit. I can do some fades. And of course, I would do this a little slower, but in the interest of demoing, I just want to show you guys how quickly it is to determine the song spacing. Songs can overlap. Songs can overlap if they need to. That's why I like to use the 2-track approach, because you never know if a client's going to say, hey, can we overlap these two songs or something like that. So basically, you listen through and figure out the correct gaps between the songs, and let's say that that's how I want it. There's a thing called the CD Wizard, so I'm running that. I'm also using a Stream Deck to really turbocharge some of my shortcuts, and I'll do this a lot slower in a moment, but I basically created markers for all the songs, and now I'm going to create CD text. So I'm entering in the album title and the performer name. Our band name is the WaveLabs. And I'm pushing that performer name to all the tracks, and I'm grabbing all the marker names and converting that to CD text. So basically, I've just entered in all the CD text for every song. If you need to do ISRC codes, WaveLab has a nice feature that lets you enter in the first ISRC code. A lot of times, the codes go in numerical order, so you can just enter the first code and press apply, and now I've got my ISRC codes. So at this point, I would maybe add a limiter. So I have a little effects chain preset. I'm going to go over all this in the video, but just real quick, I could just dial in my final limiter and say, everything sounds great. And now it's time to render the files. So the first thing I do, I'm going to get this going and then explain it. So the first thing I do is I render a full file of the montage. And I've talked with a few mastering engineers about this. And basically, we render a full file because, for one, we want to lock in all the processing at the highest sample rate and keep it as floating point, because we're going to be doing some dithering and resampling and dithering later. So the first step is really just to lock in all the processing as one long file. And it's with my settings, I have WaveLab is going to recreate this montage. Everything is going to stay exactly the same. The marker names are going to be there. The marker names are going to stay the same. It basically carries everything over except all the processing is locked in. And from there, we can render, our other formats. So this has got about a minute left. I'm actually going to remove the plugins for the sake of rendering speed. So I can do this a little faster. So let's say I got everything sounding the way I want, song spacing, titles, all this stuff. I'm going to render a full file of the montage. And from here, we can continue working. So I also I'll just do it this way. I have a little shortcut to copy that montage name and translate it to this one. I take that off so I know that this is my rendered version. The audio is still floating point, but what I'm going to do here is add a 24-bit dither. And from here, I could render 24-bit 96K wave files of each song, each audio, each CD track, each album track. But in the real world, 96K isn't quite so useful yet. It's great for high-resolution audio, but we usually need to go down to 44.1 at some point. WaveLab has a great feature called Custom Montage Duplicate, and I'm going to take this floating point 96K wave, and I'm going to downsample it using my sample rate conversion of choice. Some people prefer Weiss-Sericon, some people like RX. WaveLab also has pretty good resampling since version, I think, 9.5. But even if I wanted to use WaveLab's resampling, I would use the batch processor because I really just like this concept of locking in the processing at the highest sample rate and then working down from there. We don't want to be rendering our final limiter at 44.1 because it may not sound as good. So I'm going to let that resample. So now I have a 44.1K version of my master. So I can close RX. And there's a great feature called Custom Montage Duplicate. And what this is doing is saying, hey, show me where the downsampled version is. So I'm going to point it to that and press OK. And now I have a 44.1 version of this montage. And again, all the data is correct. So now I can rename this 2444 to indicate 24-bit and 44.1K sample rate. Now the montage is bit depth agnostic. There's no bit depth. I'm calling it 24-bit because I have a 24-bit dither inserted. So from here, I can render 24-bit WAV files of each track. So I'm going to do this. I like to call it 2444 WAVE. And this is all going in my project folder, so everything's going to be nice and organized. I can give you some tips on how to do that. I'm using a render preset called 24-bit wave tracks, and I'm going to render waves of each song. And I didn't mention this, but in the description of this video, there's going to be links to some of my preferences, settings, and things like that can help you get started with WaveLab or add to your existing setup. So I've just done some 24-bit waves of this project. And now I can go to this folder and see that I have a 24-bit wave for each song. It's nicely numbered and named. And there is some metadata in these files, although the Mac Finder doesn't display metadata very well in waves. We'll get to that in a moment. So let's say I want to make a DDP instead. I like to change this to 1644 because I'm going to use a 16-bit dither because DDP has to be 16-bit. I'm using some shortcuts. I really love WaveLab because you can use existing path names and just fine-tune them. So I've already rendered to this path. This is going to be a DDP though, so I can just change the lettering. And now I'm rendering a DDP that's going to be exactly the same as my WAV files. It's really important in mastering that all your master formats are cohesive. You know, you want the same track spacing in all your formats. You want the same titles. You want everything to be as consistent as possible so that all your masters going out are totally cohesive. So there's a DDP. I can use this program. This is what I use to send out to my clients. So I can load it in, look at it. Everything's nice and clean and has the same data as the montage. So that is great. You know, can send that out to your client to approve. So, but a lot of clients also like to have MP3 versions, whether it's for casual listening, sending to friends and family. That's more mobile friendly. People are on their phones these days a lot instead of computers. So I'm going to render MP3 files as well. So I'm just going to change the name of this montage to 6444 for MP3 encode because I'm not going to dither to MP3. There's a debate about whether or not we want to do that. I'll talk about it later. But I'm going to render MP3 files. And the nice thing with MP3s is I could add some artwork to this. So I can go to the metadata section, find the cover artwork, which is just a funny picture I found. And I'm going to choose my render preset of MP3 tracks. And again, I really like this location, this path name. You can just edit it as you wish. It's a lot more flexible than other programs I've used. So now I'm rendering MP3s of each song, and let's open these files up in a metadata app. You know, we don't have to use a metadata app to tag the files because WaveLab is great. I'm just showing you what they look like to the end user. So if they were to load this into a media player, they're going to see the artist name, the title, the track number, and track total. So it just looks really professional. The MP3s basically look how files are going to look, you know, back when you could purchase songs from iTunes Store. Everything just looks really professional and nice. And again, here's how the folder looks. So now we have a folder of our 24-bit waves, our DDP, MP3s. Everything is just really cohesive, and I can do it a lot faster when I'm not talking. But that's a quick rundown of how I get files in and out of WaveLab. So it's really quick. And of course, in my initial montage, if I wanted to put plugins on a certain song, I can certainly do that. Ideally, if I did a good job in the analog realm, I wouldn't need to do anything song specific, but sometimes maybe a song needs to be a little brighter, a little more bass, change the level. I'm going to get into all that next, but that's just a really quick overview of how I get a basic album in and out of WaveLab to to do the final processing, the metadata, the CD text. I see a question about 5.1. I'm going to be honest, I don't work in 5.1, so I haven't used really any software for 5.1. I know that WaveLab has some multi-channel capabilities, and there's been some ideas on how to improve that, so I think it's coming, but unfortunately I'm not going to be the best person to tell you about 5.1 in WaveLab, unfortunately. Maybe we could do a separate video on that when I understand it better and maybe when some enhancements come, but I just personally work in the stereo realm. Stereo realm for basically all my work. And sorry if I'm repeating myself. I'm trying to read some of Harold's questions in real time. So that is, in a nutshell, how I get stuff in and out of WaveLab. It's super simple. Again, I've searched all the options for mastering software, and WaveLab is by far my favorite. Super thankful that it came to Mac about 10 years ago. But anyways, that's that. I'm going to start over now and just kind of do a run through of some of the settings that, as a new user or maybe as a intermediate user, that you may want to be aware of or change or update. So I'm actually going to close out of WaveLab and start over. Let's close this media player, all that stuff. So when you first open WaveLab, there is a little menu that can pop up. I basically really like to have it start as an empty project. I just like a clean slate. I like to have a clean slate when I open WaveLab. I don't want it to open my last project. I find that to be annoying if it's a lot of plugins that have to load. And I actually check this box so that I don't even see this box again when I open WaveLab. So I'm going to close it and show you my view when I first open WaveLab. It's just really empty. When you first install WaveLab, you probably have it looking like this, and it's pretty busy, and some people like that. I have a little layout preset, which I'll get to in a little while, that just straightens that, organizes the meters a little better. It makes the master section floating, which I'll get to, and just kind of simplifies things. So the main thing to know about WaveLab is it has two main workspaces. It has a basic audio editor, which is it's just a destructive audio editing environment. Some people like this for sound design if you're in broadcast. If you're in creative control, maybe destructive editing is good because it's done. But if you have clients that are going to perhaps change their mind, you probably don't want to be in a destructive environment because it's not so easy to undo, although there are some nice improvements. But it has the audio editor, and then it has the audio montage, which I showed you in my little walkthrough. The audio montage is where I do 99% of my work, but I am going to show you the audio editor first because it's a little simpler and quicker to get through. But some basic settings to be aware of. In the preferences, you just go to WaveLab and preferences. There is a settings folder, and this is kind of an important folder that I think that you should save in your favorites. So I have in my sidebar, I have saved it as a favorite because especially on Mac, I'm not a Windows user, but on Mac, this folder is hiding in the library, and Mac OS has basically made the library a little bit hidden. So maybe you already know how to find the library, but if not, basically you press this open setting folder, and it's going to display your WaveLab preferences folder. And as you can see, I have it saved as a favorite. If I didn't have it saved as a favorite, I can show you how to do that. You just go to open the setting folder, and you could do something like that. So now I've lost it. Open setting folder. So here's my WaveLab. So this is how it should happen for you if you haven't done it yet. And then you can simply drag it to a favorite. You're going to use this a lot. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to link you to my whole preferences folder. So if you wanted to be on the same page as me, you could simply delete all the files in this folder and drag mine in. It's linked in the description. It is important that the structure looks the same, so when you unzip the file, you have to put these folders back exactly as you were. Now, if you have some presets and settings that you want to keep, then you have to be a little more careful about deleting everything. But basically, that's where the settings folder is. That's how you find all your preferences. It's also good to back that up. I back this up every few days or every few weeks so that if I were to have a computer crash, get a new computer, I have all my WaveLab preferences backed up, and within a matter of seconds, I can be back to where I was. And it's also helpful for copying those to your other computers if you have a laptop or a secondary setup. It's an easy way to keep all your settings up to date with shortcuts and things like that. So the setting folder is pretty important, and that's a great way to find it easily. Display has a couple interesting options. I like to check this option of using the system file selector. That basically uses your native Mac or Windows file selector, because otherwise, WaveLab does have a file area. It's a little busy for me anyway. There's a lot of options. It's great. But if you just want a simple way to open files that looks a little more familiar to you and use the native Mac menu, that's where you do that. So again, that's something I like to do. Let's get back to there. I also like to have it so it doesn't, when I undo or redo something, the zooming doesn't change. I like to keep my zoom where I wanted to park it. There's some other kind of self-explanatory settings in here. If you press the little arrow, you can hover over things and get an idea, but I'm just going to highlight some of what I consider important ones. And for me, it's this system file selector and the undo redo. We have a question about this. The audio editor in WaveLab 10 does have some options to, I'll show you. It does have some options to recover. So this is new to WaveLab 10. I'm not going to go into that today, but it does let you sort of revisit, restore a selection to its original state. But for the most part, it is a destructive environment, in my opinion. It's sort of, with that addition, maybe it's a gray area, but it's really not a great place to assemble EPs and albums because of things I'll show you. So again, the montage is great for me, from my opinion. So let's go back to this. With audio, there's really not many settings in here. You can decide if it's processing in 64-bit float or 32. This resample thing is really just for when you do tasks that require WaveLab to resample. Like if you have a 96K montage and you load in a 44.1 file, which I don't advise, but if you would do that, you can tell WaveLab to use its best algorithm, best sounding. Formats, really nothing in here that I want to talk about today. CD writing, even though we don't make a lot of CDs, some of the settings in here do apply to DDP creation, which you may want to bump this up to 80 minutes. And again, you can hover over some of these tool tips to show you. And the options, I have these turned off, but some people like it so that when they render a file, the task meter is visible so they can see how long it's going to take. There's also one on the bottom that works well enough for me, and you can also have it make a sound when it's done rendering if you want to. But as you can see, I have these turned off. WaveLab 10 allows you to send audio to an external editor, and that's a really nice feature. You could use Spectre Layers Pro, which is fairly new. You could use Isotope RX, which is a popular external editor. But the point here is you could highlight a little section of audio. WaveLab will send a copy of it to your preferred external editor. You can make the correction, and then when you toggle back to WaveLab, the fixed version is in your timeline. So that's a really nice new feature. I use it a lot. Because while WaveLab does have some spectral editing, Spectre Layers is great, and there's some other options, and there's other things you may need to do. So this is just a nice little way to get audio in and out of the montage or the audio editor to another program for any quick little fixes where you don't want to, close out of WaveLab and go to another app. So the audio connections, this is basically where you choose your sound card, your audio device. There's a little control panel for the buffer size. Depends how you work, but I always have this set to 0 dB because I'm using a monitor controller to control the level of my speakers. There's a refresh button that helps if you've made any changes. You can save all these settings as presets too, because I have kind of two scenarios of where I use WaveLab. I have a RME AES device that has a lot of ins and outs, and then I have just a simple USB to AES for just stereo listening. Anyways, you can save all these settings as presets. And in here we have playback settings. So there's a main playback bus, and I have that going to, excuse me, I have that going to outputs 1 and 2 of my card. And this gets a little bit more into the analog routing, which I'm going to cover in another video, but I also have all my D to A and A to D converters lined up here for sending to my analog chain. And interestingly down here, though, we're going to cover this today. I use reference tracks to send basically an unprocessed version of the audio to a different output on my audio device, which goes to my monitor controller. So basically, on my monitor controller, I can press a button and I can listen to what I'm working on, and then I can toggle to the reference track output, which could be the unmastered version, so you can compare if you're making things better or not, or if it's just louder. So it's a good way to compare the original sound to what you are doing. It could also be a different song. Sometimes clients send you a reference file of what they want to sound like. It could also be the mix engineer's kind of rough master. A lot of times mix engineers will put a limiter on to just get the song louder and please the client. And you can kind of compare with their limited version to see if you're in the ballpark or hopefully doing better, not doing worse. Anyways, you can assign and add and subtract. You can add and subtract devices right here and assign them. So, this output is going to AES 3 and 4, 5 and 6, 7 and 8. So I have a few options for feeding my chain, and then on the recording side, a few options for recording back into the montage. External effects. We're going to get into all these in a different video with the analog gear. This is meant to be a simple video for now. And I am going to try to get to some questions in a moment once I'm through all this. So some final settings. The ASIO guard just helps with performance. You can't have it perform a short fade in when starting playback to avoid any clicks and pops. This is an important one for people using multiple apps. You can have WaveLab release the audio driver when the app's in the background or when Cubase and the Windows in the foreground, things like that. So this is basically where you check out all your audio settings. Shortcuts. WaveLab is pretty good at customizing shortcuts. And if you download my presets from the video description, you'll have some stuff that I've customized. This is basically where you can search for a shortcut. So if I want to insert audio files into the montage, you can see that the default one is Shift-Command-I. I've shortened it to just Command-I because I can do it with one hand, and it's something I do for every project. So I've just kind of simplified that. But the shortcuts area helps you see what shortcuts exist or reprogram your own shortcuts. So let me go back to that. Insert audio files. I can double click on the key sequence and it brings up this window and it will let me program my own. So I could clear it and I'll just do the same one. I could press Command-I and now I've just programmed my own custom shortcut for this action, and that's great. So WaveLab's really customizable in that regard. As far as seeing what the shortcuts are, you can search for them, program your own. It's really great. So plugins, this is another kind of important setting area. The general part of the plugins doesn't tell you too much, but if you're having an issue with a plugin showing up, there is a handy button that forces a new plugin scan. when you launch the software. But the organize section is really useful. I'm going to keep it on this screen if anyone needs to pause it, because there's some settings over here that I like that I set up a long time ago. And I'm going to be honest that I can't explain it real quickly, but I know that this works really well for me as far as the way that things are sorted. And over here is a list of all the plugin developers that are available. And you can unfold or expand. So here's all my DMG plugins. And when you see 3 little stripes, that means it's a VST3 plugin. And as you can see, I've disabled all the VST2 versions because I don't have the effect box checked. So it's just not even going to show up. I prefer to not see things I'm not going to need. But just as a quick rundown, we have this particular plugin, and I have it enabled as an effect. And I have it saved as a favorite. This little crown means it's one of my favorites. There are different plugin slots that I'll get into, but this is basically how you can see your plugins. I can go to another vendor. I like these guys. So I can, as you can see, again, I have the VST2 plugins just totally hidden. I could turn them on in a click of a button if I wanted to use them for troubleshooting, but basically I always start with VST3, and if there's an issue, I can try the VST2 and see if that gets any better, if anything changes. But I try to start with VST3 and disable VST2. So this lets you, again, just kind of manage which plugins are visible and where. Remote devices, going to skip over that. Folders, I believe I've kept this pretty much all standard, but this helps you determine what you see when you try to open a file or save a file, which folder that you see. And in addition, if you're wondering when I'm working, I'm using a third-party app called Default Folder X, and this really helps me get things navigated quickly to where I want to go, in addition to WaveLab's nice settings, so that when I go to render some files, that I can quickly get to that folder that's needed. Variables, this is all handled in metadata, so I'm going to skip over that. This is kind of some deeper stuff. But the last 2 sections I want to hit here are audio files, and audio montages have their own special little preferences. So in the audio files preferences, we have a couple important things I want to highlight. Here is, it's actually in the File tab, but basically a lot of this is self-explanatory as well, and you can use the tool tip to hover over stuff. WaveLab can show you like an overview of the waveform, so no matter how you're zoomed in, you can see a whole overview. I don't particularly, I'd rather have more screen real estate, so I have this turned off, but you could turn on having an overview at the top of the screen of the edit window, so you can see the whole file even though you're zoomed in. But one really important setting that's probably useful for new users is this setting right here, create peak files in an independent folder. So when you first start using WaveLab, you might notice that next to each wave file is a GPK file. And if you like to keep your file structure clean, you probably don't want all these GPK files hanging around. So what you can do is check this box, and it's going to put those GPK files in an independent folder. And I honestly don't even know where this is on my computer. It's somewhere on my computer in the library. And those files I never have to see them or think about them. But what the GPK file does is it helps WaveLab quickly draw the waveform so that you can see it on the screen, which makes sense. Anyways, those are graphic peak files, and they're important, but they're not essential, because if you move this project to a different system, it can redraw the waveforms in a matter of seconds. But anyways, you probably want to check this box to get those GPK files just kind of in a folder that you'll never think about or see again. So that's an important setting. You can also really customize the color of the waveforms, the background, how everything looks. It's really customizable. I haven't really dug in too far, but you can kind of play around with that. I do like the black theme in general of WaveLab. It's easy on the eyes. So those are settings specific to the audio editor and audio files. If you go here, These are audio montage specific settings, and this is for the active montage. I prefer that when I insert files into the montage that there's no space between them. I like to manually space out the songs and just go by ear about what feels right. Sometimes your clients might even send you a mock-up of the whole album of how they want the song spaced. And what's nice about WaveLab 10 is you can put that on a reference track and you can visually and audibly kind of line up your master versions to what they did as a mock-up for the song spacing. Sometimes clients just say use your judgment on the spacing, and other clients are really specific about it. And but anyways, I like it so that when I insert the files, it's just no time between them, and I do it all manually. If you wanted it to default to 2 seconds between each song when you first insert it, you could do that and still fine tune it. Really up to you, but I just keep it at 0 because I find that to be the cleanest. This is a area for all audio montages. Basically, your auto save, because a montage it's a little bit like your Cubase session file or your Pro Tools, the .ptx file. It's basically a file that tells WaveLab where all the wave files go, or audio files, and all the plugin settings. So it's a rather small file. That's why when you saw me doing save as and all this stuff, it's not creating a bunch of audio files. It's just creating a little montage file, a .mon file. And again, they're really small, and this little setting can do auto backups every 15 minutes, however much you want. A lot of these settings are probably just default. You can, in the montage itself, you can nudge things by a certain amount of time. I have it set to 10 milliseconds if I want to use a shortcut to nudge it. You can nudge the gain of a song up or down, and you can determine that. I think 1 dB is the lowest it goes, so that's that. So there's a couple other settings here, but those are the main ones. And again, you can change the style of how the waveform looks. But I really, in this display section, I really like the black theme, but there is a light theme if you prefer that. It depends on your personal preference. So that's a basic rundown of the preferences to be aware of, and a couple things to touch on there that aren't in that area would be with the transport. Now, I have the transport hidden because I really just start and stop and record. I don't do anything too tricky with the transport. But let's say I did. You can use this little button over here to hide and show certain things. And I have the transport hidden, but you can have it at the bottom. And new users are going to want to at least do this, because when the default setting of WaveLab is such that when you play the audio and stop it and then start up again, it goes from the same spot, a little bit like a tape machine. It just start, stop. Most people prefer that when you stop the audio, that it jumps back to where the cursor was. So that's how I prefer it. So I can keep listening to the start of this particular song to get it right or whatever. And that's how I prefer it. So you want to right click on the stop button and just make sure this box is checked so that after playback, the cursor moves back to the start position. That's a common question for new users. So I just wanted to touch on that. And again, you can I have shortcuts for turning the loop on and off. It's just the /. We'll turn the loop on and off. I don't do a lot of rewinding. I do a lot of skipping around to markers like this, or back to the start. But I really don't use the transport in my workflow. You may want to see it, but I like to hide it to get more screen real estate. The other thing new users might want to hide is the file groups. There's a way that you can have different groups of files open, and it's basically like an extension of your tabs. So it's just a way to have a lot of files open and stay organized. I tend to not have a lot of files open at one time because of how I work, and I'll explain that. So if you want to go up to this button again, you can go to File tabs, and you can hide those, and you get a little more screen real estate. So this is basically a way to arrange a couple things. I like the command bar at the top left. That's something you do need, but I like to hide the transport. And I like to hide the file tabs because it just gives me more space. Um, so that is a quick little thing to be aware of. So let's look at the audio editor. I'm going to open a file so that we can do that. I'll open up a WAV file. So here's a WAV file, and a couple things are shared by the montage and audio files, such as the metering. We have a loudness meter that shows the LUFS. We have a level meter that shows peak levels in RMS. Also, one thing I really like, and I don't see in a lot of programs, I like this panning meter. It kind of tells you if things are off center or how centered things are. It's a nice. WaveLab has really great built-in metering. So again, these are shared by the montage and the audio file. So I could even open that montage and go between them. I can use control and page up to quickly change between files. Again, meters, the loudness meter is great. One thing, another thing with new users, and even if you grab my settings, this particular setting doesn't carry over for some reason, but by default, WaveLab is set to loudness units. Let's see here. It's set to it's set to relative loudness units. So you see this plus 12. We don't really talk about music in that way. When we think about music, we say, Spotify or a streaming service may normalize to minus 14, or if we master something to minus 9 LUFS, that's starting to get pretty loud. So I don't particularly care for the default setting of this, and I have a preset that I've made. So if you right-click in the loudness meter, you'll get that settings option, or you can go to the functions menu. And I have a preset called JP Start, but you can do this yourself. But basically, I have it set to full scale so that when I play this song, it's showing me that it's the integrated loudness is minus 11 LUFS. That's typically how we tend to talk about songs and even broadcast, in my opinion. So that's something you may want to change as you get started with WaveLab. And again, these are shared between the montage. Whatever's playing is going to display here. There's a time code meter, which this is really what separates WaveLab from a multi-track DAW. Because when you're mastering, you want to know where's 2 minutes and 45 seconds of song 3. And if you're in a multi-track DAW, that's really hard to find, because your counter is for the entire project, whereas WaveLab has this time code box, and right now I have it set to show me the time based on the CD track start marker. So I can see that I'm playing at 2 minutes and 43 seconds of the third song. If you right-click, you see some options. You can have it be the start of the clip, which is usually very similar to the start of the CD track, but not always. You can have it show you the file start, which is the montage file, which basically mirrors your timeline up here. So I don't really use the file start setting, except for with a standalone audio file, of course. But in the montage, I like to have it set to CD track start, so I can see the actual time of that particular song that I'm playing. We also have some meters, some frequency-based meters, the spectroscope, spectrometer. We have a wave scope, so you can actually see the waveform. There is a phase scope, which can be handy. I have a little shortcut programmed as Control P. But if you just go up to the top, you can see all the available meters. You can see all the available tool windows, which we'll get to in the future here. But meters, one great thing WaveLab has, the bit depth meter. So this montage has been this montage is playing 24-bit audio, so the bit depth meter is showing me that. And there are some edits there. It might make more sense to go to this montage. Actually, it might make more sense for me to add a limiter, and then it will surely be. So you can see right here that it's playing floating point audio. So the bit depth meter is really handy. If you're using my settings, you can use Control and the letter B to toggle the bit depth meter. I like to just kind of keep it floating and pop it in when I need it, things like that. So within the audio file. I'm going to close all but this audio file. We have a View tab. This is your basic navigational stuff. You can zoom in and out. I use Command and the scroll wheel to zoom in and out. I also have some key commands programmed in my personal preferences, which is the letter R to zoom out and the letter T to zoom in, because I was used to that from a different program. But if you want to manually zoom, you can. If you want to manually move the cursor, you can do that. Static view just makes it so that it doesn't do any scrolling. If you want the cursor to follow, if you want the view to follow your cursor, you can choose this. I like static view because when I'm listening and editing, it throws me off when it starts scrolling. So view is pretty self-explanatory. Edit has some useful things, such as you can copy audio. It's basically like your standard edit, but it gives you some nice examples. You can do left channel only or both. You can swap the audio channels. And remember, this is destructive, so I tend to not do a lot of stuff in here unless it's either a copy of the file or I know what's going to need to happen. The recover, and I'll zoom in on this, but it does let you replace a selection with the original audio samples. It's more of an advanced feature, so I'm not going to cover it today. And this also does let you select a part and send it to an external audio editor. I'm going to show you that in the montage section, so we'll skip that for now. This does let you add some markers. In the audio editor, I really don't have a need to add markers. I do that in the montage, but you can add markers, things like that. The process section is pretty useful. You can change the gain of the whole song or just the selection. You can draw an envelope, kind of automated envelope. You can remove DC offset. You can change the whole level of a song. You can normalize the loudness of a file if you need to. And one thing that I really like about WaveLab, don't use it a lot, but it's there, is you can do panning normalization. So if you have a file that is off center, like if it's too much information on the right and you want to correct that, you can use the pan normalizer to fix that. Again, that's a creative decision. You can do fade-ins and fade-outs, but I really don't do fade-ins and outs here because it's hard to change them after the fact. So it's much better to do that in the montage where you can adjust the fades non-destructively and change things if the client requests it. There's time stretching and pitch shifting, things like that, resampling, pitch bending. Reversing is handy. The other week I was remastering an album and it needed a radio edit, and there was no way to remix the song as an old project. So what I did is just brought it in here, highlighted it, and reversed that little section to get rid of the curse word. And so reverse is a handy little feature. Auto split, this is more for if you do a long recording and you want to break it up based on silences and things like that, you can split the file with some automated settings. You can invert the phase, all sorts of stuff. Correction gets into removing clicks and pops and sort of restoration stuff. A more newer feature is spectrum, and this is where WaveLab's spectral editing can occur. So this is your normal view. You can go to a spectrogram view and see how things look that way, and you can highlight some problems and correct them. We'll go over all that, but this is where you find the spectral editor and make some changes. The Analyze tab is one thing that I do use quite a bit. Often, I use it either when I get files to master to check them out when a client sends a mix, just to see what does it look like, what does it sound like. So I'll load them in here, and you can do a global analysis of the whole file, and it goes really quickly. So I've just analyzed the file, and I can see my peak levels. So this is not a great example, but the digital peaks are 0, and the true peaks are just over 0. And it's going to show me the loudness. So it's showing me the integrated LUFS, the short-term maximum. So all the LUFS readings, it's nice, a very quick offline um, analysis of the files. There are some pitch things that I don't really get into. It'll tell you if there's any DC offset. And these are some captures from my analog chain. That's why they're at these levels. So the analysis is really handy, and you can have multiple tabs open. So you could press the plus button, and now I can analyze this file, and I can kind of compare them and see their various loudness properties. So the Analyze tab is really handy. And then the Render tab would be if you wanted to just process this file as a standalone file. And to do that, you need to use the master section, which I haven't really covered yet, but the Render tab is just to apply processing to a standalone file without using the montage. So that is a quick overview of the audio editor. And if there is any metadata in the files, you can see it here. If there are any markers, you can see it there. You can see a little history of any edits. So that is that. I do need to take just a brief time out to read through some comments and whatnot. So let's All right, so we're going to get into the audio montage now, and I basically have a preset, which I'll show you how to do. But if you're using my settings, you press Control and the number 9, and that creates a new montage. And the nice thing about that is it has some things dialed in that you're probably going to want to have for most projects. Really, the metadata preset is already loaded, which we'll get to. When you do open up the CD wizard, it's set to how I think is a good setting. It loads a lot of things behind the scenes, basically for us. So I'm going to kind of go through a project and cover the montage at the same time. Now, one kind of common question that I see is file management. So the first thing I do before I even open WaveLab, maybe I can demonstrate this. The first thing you want to do is get your files in the right place. So I always make a folder for the band name or artist name, and I make sure it's spelled exactly how they want to spell it, because this comes in handy for just file renaming and metadata entry. So I have a folder for the artist name. Then I have a folder for the release title. And especially with people doing singles, sometimes you end up with a number of projects before you have time to archive them. But really, my whole point here is you want to have your the files you need in the folder. WaveLab doesn't really copy the files into your session for you. There may be some roundabout ways of doing that, but basically, before I even open WaveLab, and this is again for an in-the-box mastering session, we'll do another video integrating the analog gear. But especially with the current situation of everyone being staying in at home and whatnot, there's probably a lot of in-the-box mastering happening. So we'll go through that. So basically, these are the mixes that I was sent to master. And as you can see, they're named kind of long and not the actual song title. And that's okay. I keep the native file names. I don't want to change them. We'll do this in WaveLab. But I set up this folder structure because it works really well for me. Artist name, release title, and then an original files folder where those original mixes go. So these mixes are already 96K. So this will give a good rundown of how to work at the highest sample rate and work your way down, similar to how I did at the start of the video. So that's the first thing I do before I even open WaveLab. And what's nice about this is then when you go to back up your project, all the files that you need are in this folder. You don't have to worry about a stray file going missing and things like that. So file management is really important in mastering. So I'm going to open up WaveLab and make a new montage. I have a shortcut for that, but if you go to this little icon here, you can choose a new audio file or a new montage. So I'm going to do a new montage, and that's that one way, but I'm going to use my preset, which is Control-9. You can also use this button, Control-9, and this loads my particular preset. Now the preset area is in File, Save As, it's a new audio montage templates. So you could once you get things dialed in how you like, you could add a new template, give it a name, your name, your favorite template. And there are some settings, including if you want to include any audio clips. I really wouldn't want to include any audio clips because the idea is that this is for a new project and you probably don't want to include any plugins, but maybe you do. But these are the options you have. And then you could save that, and then you could also right click and set it as a default so that when you make a new montage, that's the one that is created. I work at 96K a lot. And then you can also have shortcuts for your different montages. If I wanted to do an album at 88.2, you can see that I've set a shortcut, which is Control-8 to make an 88.2K version of that. Anyways, we're going to work at 96K so I can give you the full rundown. So the audio montage, again, shares a lot of the same metering. This area in here is called the ribbon tab, and it's available for audio files and montages, but the options are a little different. There's no analyze. In the montage, the analyze tab is much more minimal because you can really only analyze the playback or the audio input, whereas the audio editor has more options because the file is already there and it can analyze the song in real time. So unfortunately right now, if you're working on a montage and you want to know the loudness of a whole song, you have to render it first and then analyze it. We'll explain all that. So the ribbon tab has a lot of similarly named tabs, but I'm going to go through them all now. So the first thing I do is I like it so that the cursor's at 0. That's part of my montage preset. If you're not using my settings, it's Shift-Command-I, but I'm using Command-I because I've shortened it. And this brings up a box to, it's asking me what files do you want to load in. So I'm going to navigate to the original files folder because these are the files that need to be mastered. And I'm going to select them all. And before they're inserted, I love this about WaveLab. It's asking me what order do I want the files to be inserted. And this is a huge time saver because I can rearrange the files. You can click and drag them. For me, that's a little putsy and slow. I like to use the shortcuts, which is the up and down arrow will let me select a particular song. And then if I hold Command and press up and down arrow, it moves it in time. So I have a project management app where all this is in, or you may have an email, but I just made a quick text document. So this is the song order that the client wants. So I'm just going to quickly arrange that. Before I do that, though, let's go through the three options. Option number one down here is I can line all these files up on the current track, which maybe some people like to use just one track. I like to use two tracks, which I'll show you. But the other option is to place each file on a separate track. This may be useful for if you're mastering stems or alternate versions, but you really don't want to have all your files look like that. That's not really ideal for mastering EPs and albums. So the setting I use, or I like to use, is the second one, which is to stagger the files on two alternating tracks. And you'll see why in a moment. But let me get back to this track listing. And again, I'm quickly using the up and down arrows to get the songs in the correct order. Up and down selects them, and Command up and down will actually move them. So now that the songs are in their correct order, and if you need to find more files for some reason, you can add more to this list before you import them. You can use these arrows to move them up and down, but the shortcuts are really great. So anyways, I've got these songs in the correct order. And again, the first thing I like to do is save this because that's just my habits, really. So I'm going to press Command S to save the montage because, again, this is a montage. If you look up here, this is a project, so there's a lot of settings that are going to get saved. And because of my folder structure, I can just copy the band name and I can copy the release name. You want to be careful not to copy any slashes because that will be confusing to WaveLab. But basically, I call my projects this. I call them band name, release name. 6496 indicates that WaveLab is processing at 64-bit floating point and that the montage itself is 96K. This is the digital master. It's version 1. And this little underscore indicates that it's the master version where all the plugins are basically going to be loaded. So that's how I like to name stuff. And what's great about all these settings is that I don't even have to touch the location because WaveLab knows to save the montage in the same folder where all the original files came from. So I don't even have to touch this. I can do this in a matter of 3 seconds if I don't talk and just do it. So that is what I do. I initially save the montage just to get it locked in so that if anything happens, I can get back to this point. So let me try to think how I want to do this. Well, the first thing I do, I'll show you around the montage, but the first thing I do is, of course, trim up the files, because in my first example, those files were already trimmed and really clean and ready to go. These files have not been touched. So I'm going to do a quick cleanup. So this song has over 1.5 seconds of just kind of dead space. I'm using Command and scroll wheel to zoom this way, and I can use Shift and scroll wheel to blow up the waveform to see any noise better. So this has, it's not a problem, but I'm going to trim up this noise by clicking on the left side of the waveform. And I can do a little fade in just so that there's no clicks or pops or anything when that waveform starts. And I like to start my first file at about 200 milliseconds. We'll get to markers later, but that's where the first piece of audio, this is a breath, before the song starts. If this were a stick click or a count in, I could easily trim it off and just have the song start kind of clean like that if I wanted to. But basically, I like it so my first moment of sound, whether it's, a downbeat or some kind of note, about 200 milliseconds. And again, I'm going to go to the end of the song and listen to how that ends. And I purposely don't have any music playing because really, it's not really about the music today. It's really just about workflow stuff. So I'm listening to how this song ends, and there's a lot of extra space, which is very normal. It's actually great when mix engineers leave a lot of heads and tails at the end. We can do noise reduction. So I'm going to just kind of taper this out. I'm using a shortcut to do that exponential fade. And I might as well get into this. If you go up to the ribbon tab here in the fade ribbon tab, you have different fading options. You have all these fade out curves and a lot of different options. But basically, I've programmed letter X to be an exponential fade. For me, this fade shape works really well because if you just do the normal linear fade, at the very end, it seems to just drop off too unnaturally quick. So a quick question: if a client gives me 48K files, I personally do like to upsample to 96. This is a controversial topic, but I have done a little testing, and to my ears, it sounds better if I do the processing at 96K. If I get stuff in at 88.2, I'll work there. If I get stuff in at 48 or 44.1, I'll upsample to 96. But basically, if things come in at 88.2 or higher, I work at that native sample rate. And WaveLab makes it really easy to work at that sample rate and then make sure that all your downstream renders are totally cohesive and everything is exactly the same down to the sample with all your formats. That's another reason why I love WaveLab. So I do upsample before I even bring them into the montage if they come in at a 48 or lower. So, I'm going to listen to this. I'll say that sounds like a nice fade. Now this song, again, has a lot of space before it. I can trim it up so that it's a clean start. I can listen and determine how much space there needs to be between these two songs. There's no right answer, but that is what I do. Now this song has like some feedback at the end. Can do that. Let's say I wanted two songs to overlap. This is part of why I use the 2-track approach, because you just never know if after the client hears the first version, maybe they'll say, yeah, let's overlap these two songs. And if you use the staggered approach, then you're already set up to really easily do that. If you use the 1-track approach, you can crossfade clips, but it just gets a little messy. So I really like the 2-track option. So I trim these up really tight. And when I make the markers, I'm going to show you that the markers are a little bit offset from each clip so that there's a little bit of buffer between when the track starts and when the file starts playing, because we don't want to have any clicks or too abrupt starts. So I'm just kind of roughing this. I'm just doing this quickly so that you guys don't get too bored. But that's the first thing I do, is just listen through to the ends of songs and figure out how they need to end and how they need to start, and figure out their song spacing. And again, shift and scrolling up will help you kind of see if there's any low-level noise. And again, I'm doing this slightly sloppy for the sake of time, but I think you guys get the idea. If you don't have any markers in place, you can use Command and page up and down, and that will toggle between each clip really quickly. So that's a quick way to check things and navigate between the starts of each clip. So we're getting there. I'll just do these real quick. But I do like to get things pretty tight so that if there is any noise or humming or whatever, that once we start putting effects right on each clip, that there's just no clicks or pops that start to occur because of that residual noise. I see some external gear questions. We're going to get to that in a second video at another time, just because this is really meant to be getting started with WaveLab and going through some things. So I do use analog gear in my studio, but we're just not going to get into that today. So here's everything kind of trimmed up. Let's say that the sequence is great. I like how everything sounds. This is when I add my CD markers, and WaveLab has such a thing called the CD wizard. And normally software wizards are not that useful, but the CD wizard is actually very great. You go up to the CD tab, and it's this icon right here. Looks kind of like a little alien logo or something, antennas. That's the CD wizard. There's also the functions menu, and you can choose CD wizard. I have a shortcut program, which is just Control C, that brings up the CD wizard. And there's a lot of settings in here. I have a preset that you can get as part of my presets that are linked in the video description. But the JP start, that's what I use basically when I start albums, because what it's going to do is it's going to create track markers. It's going to create markers at the boundaries of each clip. It's going to use what's really unique to WaveLab called CD track splice markers. And what that is it's a track end and start marker glued together as one. Because to be proper, a track has to have an end marker, and then the next one has a start marker. And you can have space between those, but it gets a little messy if you do. When it comes to rendering your files, I'll get into that. But if you use the splice markers, then you don't have that space between the markers that can cause problems when you're rendering and cohesiveness. So using splice markers is great. And we also want to create markers at crossfade points. I think I crossfaded 2 clips on purpose, and we want to make it so that it's going to create a marker there. Now we're going to have to manually manage where that marker is, but at least it will create it for us. There's some other things that I don't really use. You can do some marker naming tricks. You can have it adjust the pauses, but I've already done that manually. I really don't like to rely on that. I don't like to rely on the CD wizard to do my adjustments. I do that manually, so that's why these are turned off. And we do want to quantize the markers to the nearest CD frame. Now, I saw a comment about doing the fades after mastering. In my opinion, it's part of mastering, and you'll see why. So I like to do it first. And because it's the montage, it's non-destructive. So if a client needs to adjust something, I can do that in a matter of seconds. But, I think that's part of the mastering process and the flow of the song. So I do that kind of first. It helps me get a feel for the songs, and it's just kind of some quick utility work to get things rolling. And again, to me, it's an essential part of the mastering process is how much space is between these songs and where does this one end and this one start. So I get it out of the way first because it ties into my whole workflow here. So I'm going to run the CD wizard with these settings, JP start. Now, as I mentioned, if you have the ISRC codes and you want to put them in, you can do that. You can copy it and enter in the first one. You can also do this later. I have a preset in here that's ISRC only, so it turns off all these boxes except ISRC. So you can add them later if you get the codes at a later time. If you have the UPC, you can add it here. Now, in the US, we do 12 digits. So if you have a 12-digit code, you just add a 0 and then paste in the 12-digit code. So I'm going to apply this CD wizard settings and watch what happens. We got markers for each song, and it's a good time to Command S to save it. And the CD wizard has created markers for each song. And as you can see, the markers are named based on the names of the clips. Now, in my first demonstration, that was great because my clips were perfectly named as the song title, even down to the capitalization and punctuation. Everything was really clean. When I'm working in the box, the files are never very cleanly named, and that's kind of by design. I want to know if they sent me mix 3, mix 4, because people send mix updates sometimes. So I want to know exactly which version is in my montage. So where I do the renaming is the markers, and we'll get to that. But let's see what happened with these markers. You can see the markers are basically at the start of each clip, but also quantized to a CD frame, which I'll talk about why that's important when we get to rendering. But these are not in the ideal spot. For one, this is too close to the start of the clip. And for two, we always want the first marker to be at 0 seconds exactly. So there's a trick I'm going to do to solve both of these problems. And again, I have a shortcut program, but the slow way is to go to Markers, Functions, Move Multiple Markers. This box appears. And again, there's a preset that has my initials. And what this does is it moves 2 types of markers. It's going to move the CD start marker, which is the very first marker of the montage. And it's going to move all the splice markers, which is for each song. it's going to move these backwards by 200 milliseconds. So for all the songs, with the exception of the first one, it's going to offset that marker by 200 milliseconds. So when I skip to that track, the song doesn't start up immediately. Now, this ties into the CD days a little bit. You wanted to leave a little buffer between the track marker and the first downbeat because CD players weren't always accurate with skipping to songs, but it's also true for media players as well. Streaming services, media players. It's really a good idea to have a little buffer between the start of the file or track and the downbeat. And because we're going to have spacing between the songs anyways, we kind of use that spacing between the songs as a way to manage this. So basically the move multiple markers is going to move all the, it's not going to move the end marker, because if I move the end marker, that would probably make it so that it's in the tail end of the last song. So I basically just want to move the start marker, the very first marker, and all the splice markers backwards 200 milliseconds. But in addition, it's going to quantize them to a CD frame again. And again, I'll talk about why that's important later, but even though CDs aren't extremely popular anymore, I think it's a good idea to make your montages at least compatible with CDs, because you never know if a client will need a DDP for CD production or what, or there's a number of things. In my opinion, it's good to just still comply with that. Vinyl is back in style, cassettes are back in style. It won't be long before CDs are cool again. So I just think it's a good idea to stick with CD compatibility in terms of your track markers being on a CD frame. They don't have to be, but it's a good idea to. So anyways, this little box is handy because when I press OK, let me see if I can zoom in. I can't, but what's going to happen here is it's going to move the markers ever so slightly. And now look where this first marker is. It pushed it back to 0. And the other markers are no longer right on the start of the clip. They're offset by 200 milliseconds plus any CD frame. So this particular marker is 207 milliseconds from the start. And if we go to the markers tab up here, you can see a lot of information about our markers. We can see where the marker is, how long that track is, and how much it's offset from the clip. So many things I could talk about there, but trying to keep it somewhat basic. But what this did now, I'll skim through this session, is it made a marker for each song. Now here's that one that overlapped. And when songs overlap, you have to basically pick the least awkward place for the track transition to happen. You can't have it both ways. You can't have a clean ending and songs overlapping. You get one or the other. So you could choose to have it so that when you skip to this song, that you hear a little bit of the last song and the very beginning of this song. You may decide that this is a cleaner place to have the marker because you'll miss a little bit of the start. It'll be part of the previous track. So when you listen to the album continuously, it's still there. But when you skip to the third song, it starts right up with that downbeat. So this is up to you. And when you do manually move markers around, you want to call up that CD wizard again. I have a preset for quantize only. So when you use this preset, if you notice, the only thing that is turned on here is quantizing. So it's not going to make new markers or screw anything up. It's just going to quantize the markers to a CD frame. And in this case, it's only going to move the one that I manually moved. So before I do my initial rendering, I just make sure everything's quantized so that it's going to make sense down the line. So again, skimming through here, we can see that, this marker ended up at the tail end of that little thing. So I could nudge it. But for the most part, we have our spacing between our song. So when I render my master files, this particular track is going to have, of course, this waveform, but also this additional space is going to be part of the rendered file. And that is so that when you submit the master's files to digital distribution, that when you line them up back to back, that your song spacing is how you meant it. If you do the old school approach where you have an end marker and a start marker and there's space between your markers, if you don't use the right render settings, which is pretty common, and you put those files back to back, this space could be missing and suddenly your transitions are quicker than they should have been. And that's a problem. So basically, skimming through here, we can see that the markers are all in a pretty good spot here. There's 200 milliseconds between the start of that track and when the first downbeat comes in. Some people like to play with the last marker. Depends how the last song ends, but some people like to add maybe a half second of dead space just to give a little breath, before the album ends and it goes into something else, um, things like that. So that's basically how you get markers in, is the CD wizard. And this is a good time to rename the markers, because if you have your markers named correctly, it makes everything easier down the line. It makes your CD text and metadata a breeze. You only have to enter this information in one time. And that's, again, why I love WaveLab. I like to do things one time and have it be everywhere. So, what I'm going to do is go to my project list here and get the official song titles. And I'm renaming the markers. I'm not renaming, it's tempting to rename the CD tab or the clips tab. You really want to be sure that you're renaming the markers specifically. It's all going to make sense. So I can double click here and paste in the official song title. I'm pretty good about getting official song titles before I start for my clients, because, again, that's all part of the mastering process to me. It's, mastering is, of course, making things sound good, but it's also sequencing, metadata, quality control, all these things. You don't want to send out a project and then 3 weeks later get an email saying, here's the official song titles and track order, and can we fade this differently? It's like, no, the project's done. So you just want to get all this stuff taken care of ahead of time if you are mastering every day. Now, things come up, of course, but I would say 98% of the projects I do, once they're approved, everything is locked in. I don't have to adjust anything later. So I've just renamed all the track markers based on the official song titles. Now, it is correct that the first marker is a CD start marker. That's why it looks different. It's basically a right pointing arrow. The rest of the track markers are splice markers, which are essentially an end marker and a start marker glued together. So as you saw, when I did try to tweak this track's location, they move together. If you don't use splice markers, you have to manage the end and the start separately, and it's a headache. So splice markers are amazing for WaveLab. It's also correct that the last marker doesn't have a name. It doesn't need a name. It's just the end of the last track, which is essentially the end of the album or EP. Again, naming markers is huge, very important. The clips tab tells you information about the clips themselves, which, the length of a clip and the length of a track are going to be very similar, but let's check it out. Clip number 1 is 2 minutes, 3 seconds, 626 milliseconds. The length of the actual track is 2 minutes, 4 seconds, and 133 milliseconds. And that's because there is, of course, a little time before the clip starts. Not much, but just enough for your media players and whatnot to get in gear. And there's a little time after the clip to take care of the spacing between songs and whatnot. Now, for those that know about CD authoring, there does need to be a 2-second pre-gap before the first track. WaveLab takes care of that for you, so don't even worry about it. Just make it so your first marker is at 0. When you go to render a DDP or if you want to actually burn a CD, WaveLab handles that for you, so you don't even have to think about this. You don't have to start your sessions at 2 seconds or anything. You just basically don't even think about it. 0 seconds is 0. 2 seconds is 2 seconds in your project. So don't worry about the pre-gap. It's just kind of built in when you do things that require it. So that's another nice feature of WaveLab. But we do have the clips tab. Tells you, again, where each clip starts in the timeline and how long it is. It tells you some gain stuff, which we'll get into. A nice little thing I just thought of is if you do decide to adjust some song spacing, all the markers move and all the clips follow along too. So it's easy to adjust track spacing later. There are some settings which we'll get into. Again, I don't go into the file tab too often. I use the native operating system file browser. The view tab has some similar things to the editor. It has zooming, basically view related stuff with the scrolling. I prefer the static view because if I'm editing something and the cursor goes off screen, I don't want the view to change. Color, you can color code the clips if you want to. There's a way to do that, and there's some shortcuts for doing that as well. If you hover over it, you'll see the shortcuts. But that's a quick overview of the View tab. Edit has some more useful things that I want to talk about. The first option, Edit Source, you can highlight a section and open it in the destructive audio editor. Again, I don't do that too often. I really prefer to edit non-destructively in the montage, but that is an option. The time selection, you can use this to select a certain time range. I tend to not do that, but if you need to select something specific, you can. Clipboard stuff, pretty self-explanatory. You can split a clip if you need to into two sections. And this comes in handy for adding effects right to just that particular section. We'll get to effects very soon. You can do some nudging of time. But really what I want to get into is the ripple settings. Ripple editing is kind of unique to mastering software typically. So I keep it in global. That means if I move this clip, everything after it follows and stays, the relationship stays the same. So if a client says, can you add 2 seconds between songs 3 and 4? I can kind of do this and eyeball it. Or I can go right to the Clips tab and just type in that it starts at 8:33 now. That's a really precise way to move it by 2 seconds. But ripple mode is really important. I pretty much always keep it in global mode, and that's great. If you don't want that to happen for some reason, you can put it into none, and that lets you move a clip without anything else moving, but very rare that I do that. Track ripple mode is kind of like how it sounds. It just does it for that audio track, but again, I can't think of a reason why I'd want to do that. Pretty much always in global mode. And another setting that may not transfer over if you use my preferences is the auto grouping. It's hard to explain in words what auto grouping does, but it complicates things. As you can see now, they're all moving. I pretty much always keep auto grouping off, but I'm going to pause it here. I keep it set to none. So this is how I keep the ripple and auto grouping. I'll hover over this to see if I can let you guys see what it does. I personally don't find this feature useful, but you might. So auto grouping, set that to none if you want to not have things get selected that you didn't maybe intend to. There's some crossfade settings and for snapping, what is considered a magnet and things like that. What else do we have here? So I'm going to get into this a little bit later, but this is where you would highlight let's say I heard a click or a pop, and I want to fix that in RX for some reason, or spectral layers. I can select that little area and use my shortcut or just manually select that, and it'll open a copy of that little section in RX. I can fix the issue, save it in RX, close that, and when I toggle back to WaveLab, it'll be there. I'm going to show you how to do that in real time in a moment. Insert. A couple things in here that are useful. The CD wizard is how I really do all my markers, but if you want to add markers manually, you can. You can add a generic marker. Let's say you hear something you want to fix later, you could add a generic yellow marker. These don't really influence the rendering process. It's really just for internal reference. You could add CD starter end markers, but I really don't need to because I've done it with the wizard. However, let's say a client sends you a song that it's one clip, but it needs to be separated into 2 songs for whatever reason. It's a trilogy or something. I could split this song into 2 CD tracks by putting the cursor where I want that to happen and press, I would use the splice marker, and now it's inserted. I also have a shortcut for that, which is Control-Option-Command-M will insert a splice marker. Now, a couple things you want to do there, because you'll notice that when I move my clips, those markers that the CD wizard made are bound and following along, which is great. The one that I manually made is not. So the trick to do would be to select that clip and right-click on that new marker, and you can bind it to the audio samples of that clip. So now when I move it, that moves along too. So we would also have to name it. You know, if a client wanted that to be a separate song, you would, of course, have to type in the name of what that song is going to be for future reference. So I'm going to undo that, but you can, you know, add additional markers if a clip needs to be split into different tracks and things like that. It happens once in a while. So that is another great thing with the Insert tab. Happens a lot these days, unfortunately. Mix engineers, they may send you the wrong mix file. They may have not noticed a glitch in the mix. They may have had the tambourine reverb automation disabled, something goofy like that that's easy to miss. So let's say you're working and you get a new mix from the engineer. In some audio programs, that's a headache to deal with that file. Getting it in there without screwing up all the nice work you've done. So the Insert tab has a great feature called Replace Audio File. And I'll zoom in so you can read what it does. But basically, it's going to let me select a clip and choose a new file. And I had this kind of mocked up here. Let's say the mix engineer sends me a new file for the song Problematic. Kind of a funny name for that. So here's Mix 3 version 2. Let me find that song, Problematic. So I can select the song Problematic. I can use this button here, Replace Audio File, or my shortcut, which is Command R for Replace. It's going to say which file should we replace it with. So here is the new mix, and that just inserted a new version of that same mix. And of course, it's really helpful when the mix engineer, when the file has the same sync point, so it's perfectly in sync. But what this basically did is it's now referencing a new file a new mix. And all my settings stay the same. If there were effects on this particular song, those all stay the same. So it's, like I said, it's a real quick, easy way to pop in a new version of that mix and keep everything else cohesive. So that's the last thing I'll show you in the Insert tab. Process. There's not a whole lot I do in here, especially for a basic video, but WaveLab does have a great thing called the Meta Normalizer, which I'm going to get to in just a moment, but that allows you to normalize non-destructively all these clips to a certain level. And that's really useful for getting started with your session. You know, these mixes are all pretty close in level. I can just tell by looking, but if you get mixes that are a little all over the place level-wise, it's nice to have a way to even that out. I'll show you that in a moment, but again, fades, we looked at this a little bit, but all these fades are non-destructive. And I think that's good because, you know, the client might say, hey, you took that breath off the beginning. Can we get it back? And I can say, yep, I got the breath. It's right here. We'll put the breath back in. It could be a stick clicks, you know. It seems like if you take the stick clicks out, they say, hey, we wanted the stick clicks. And if you leave the stick clicks in, they say, hey, we thought you would remove those stick clicks. They sound terrible. So you just can't win. But with the non-destructive editing, it's really simple to get things back and adjust fades. They might say, hey, we wanted that song to not fade out so abruptly. You can just drag it back and deal with the fade. So again, fade tab is kind of useful. Envelope, let's talk about the envelope tab. Every clip has an envelope, and this is where you do some things like level automation. I can turn the whole song up or down by clicking on it. If I wanted to, let's see, what do I want to do? Let's say I want to turn this intro down. It just sounds too loud for some reason. I could click here and make some automation points and turn down just the beginning of that song. And if I want to get really tweaky, I could create a bunch of envelope points and do some really extravagant automation. This is right on the clip. This is not on a track. This is not on anything but the clip itself. And you can control. So I'm selecting volume and fades. There's also panning automation, but I'm showing you the volume and fade envelopes. You can control whether this happens before or after the clip effects. Now, we haven't really gotten to effects yet. I know that's probably a more fun thing. But if I want this automation to happen before any effects, I can, well, I leave it unselected. If I want the automation to happen after the effects, let's say you have all your compression and whatnot dialed in, maybe you want this automation to happen after that, so it's not affecting the compression settings. You could have it happen after the clip effects. You can copy and paste shapes. This is useful for if I'm doing instrumental let's say I've automated the main version. I can copy that automation to the instrumental version. I'll show you all that later. But that's what the envelope tab is useful for. You can reset it all, things like that. The Analyze tab, as I mentioned, there's not much in here in the montage because it's all real-time stuff. And then the rendering, we'll get to that at the end, but the rendering really just allows you to choose what you're rendering, or some people call it exporting from WaveLab. You can export a wave of each track. You can export a wave or MP3 of each clip, but I really don't do that because, as you can see, the clip is shorter than the track, so it's not really representative of each song. But you can export and render a lot of different things. I also use it for vinyl masters. I can make a wave of each side instead of a wave of each track. We'll get to all the rendering options in a minute, but let's get into some more fun stuff. Well, before we get into the fun stuff, let's do one last bit of detail work. So I've renamed all the markers. And a common question with WaveLab is metadata. How do I do metadata? It is a little confusing, but I have some presets for you. But basically, by getting the marker names correct, that saves you a lot of time. And you want to make sure, well, we'll get to that, but you want to get the marker names exactly what the song titles should be. Capitalization, punctuation, everything should be exactly how the client wants it to appear. So to do that, we use the CD text editor, at least I do. Now, you might be saying, CDs, I don't ever make CDs, I hate CDs. You still want to use the CD text editor as kind of a vehicle for metadata. It's just the way that I found it to be easiest. So to do this, we go up to the CD tab, and there is a little icon for CD text editor. It's this little disk with a T on it. Of course, you can go to the functions tab of this functions menu of the CD tab and go to edit CD text. But I've programmed a shortcut. I think it's something I made. Shift and the letter T brings up this box. And this box has pages, so be aware of that. The very first page of this box is asking for the album information. So you want the album title. So I'm going to go to my project manager tool and get the album title and paste that in. You want to make sure there's no extra spaces after or anything like that. It's a nice, clean album title. And you want to grab the band name or the artist name. And in CD text terms, it's called performer. Now, you can enter in the songwriter, composer, arranger. I tend to not do those fields. Sometimes my jazz and classical clients care about this, but your average client, I don't think, in terms of metadata, they tend to not really care as much about this, especially because even though we're putting this metadata in the files, when they go to upload their masters to DistroKid or their distributor, unfortunately, they still have to enter in all this information manually. So it's nice that we can put it in there for future proofing, and when they share the files directly with their fans, download codes for vinyl. I think it's great to put all this information in there still, because you just never know. But I tend to not deal with the songwriter or composer unless it's classical or jazz. Those are the kind of clients that care about it more. Anyways, I've pasted in the performer name, artist, band name, whatever you want to call it, and the album title. And I can use this button over here to copy the performer name to all the tracks in one click. So now that I've pressed that, if I scroll through, you can see, and I'm using page up and page down to scroll through. And you can also use this little slider, but I like page up and page down. It's cleaner. So as you can see, in one click, I've pushed the performer name to all the tracks. Is it really worth it to upgrade from 9.5? I think definitely, because I'm going to show you a new thing called reference tracks in WaveLab 10. And for me, I would really not want to go back to not having them. Reference tracks are a great way to listen to the unprocessed version quickly, listen to the mix engineer's rough master that they did. Usually that's what the client approves. It's also a way that you can feed your analog equipment really easily. You know, I use a reference track to feed all 3 of my D to A converters, and I can choose on my mastering console which D to A feeds the analog gear. So WaveLab 10 definitely, I think, is an important upgrade. Reference tracks alone, whether you're working in the box or the analog gear, reference tracks are just huge in my opinion. So back to this, and thank you, Harold, for fielding some of these questions directly to my inbox. So the performer name is pushed to all the tracks. The album title, I manually pasted that in because that's a one-time thing. But now we got to deal with all the track names, and we've already renamed the markers, so this makes it really easy. This first little icon, that will copy just track 1 marker name to track 1, which is good, but if you use the button next to it, this does them all in one go. So if I press this icon right here, the second one, that's going to copy all the marker names to all the tracks in CD text in one click. So now that I've clicked that, I can quickly page through and see that all my track names are populated from the marker names. And again, I'm using page up and down. I always like to double check. I'll zoom in and make sure there's no spaces, blank spaces after the names, because you don't want to have blank spaces because that can cause problems. Everything's nice and clean and tight. If you're using special characters, that can get tricky with CD text. And I've also found that when I copy and paste titles that have a apostrophe, I didn't know this, but there's different styles of apostrophe. So if you're seeing a question mark, in this area that should be an apostrophe, sometimes you just have to delete the question mark and manually type in an apostrophe with your keyboard like that. If you're using special characters, as you may know, CD text is restricted to the ASC2 or II, however you pronounce it, character set. It doesn't really like, accents over things. And fortunately, I don't do a lot of stuff that has accents. And I tend to avoid that in my workflow because that can also cause problems with file names. I know that Windows doesn't like question marks and file names or special accents. So I tend to keep things on the simpler side for my metadata and CD text, especially CD text because you have to. If I ever do get a really accent and special character heavy project, that's when I might use an external metadata editor once the project's approved. But for 99% of projects, I don't need to use an external editor for metadata, and I can just do it all right in WaveLab. That's a big reason why I use WaveLab. So now that I've done that, all the track names are pushed to CD text. And even if you're not making CDs or DDPs, you're still going to want to do this because this is how the metadata gets embedded. So now that I press OK, you can see in the CD text field that I've got this populated now. ASCII, thank you. Harold probably told me that because he does software programming in the past. So anyway, so now you can see in the CD tab that I've got CD text entered. It's showing me the track name and the artist name. You could sometimes certain tracks have featuring. So I could, for track 5, I could put the performer as WaveLabs featuring Harold. So that's where you could kind of differentiate a special track, a thing like that. So some people put it in the song title. Some people like to put it in the performer. It's really the client's call. So now that we've gotten that kind of taken care of, that's going to help us out down the line because as you can see, I've got my metadata preset already loaded. If it's not loaded, you can go to metadata, press edit, and at the very bottom, let me try to make this a little smaller. At the very bottom, we have a preset menu. And I have a number of presets that I use. And I had to edit a few things, but if you go to the description of this video, there's a link to just my metadata preset. So if you're already a WaveLab user and you just want to grab this preset, you can download it, of course, but then to put it in your system, you can open the preset menu and go to Organize Presets. It's going to open a Finder window of where WaveLab wants to see these. So you could keep this open and open another window and find the file and drag it into where it needs to be. That way, you'll have it loaded in your system. If you don't want to overwrite your preferences with all of mine, you can kind of cherry pick which presets you're grabbing. And that's true for any preset menu. Click on it, press Organize Presets, and it'll show you where on your system WaveLab looks for these presets. It could be a CD Wizard preset. So you could go here and choose Organize Presets. And that is where WaveLab is looking for your presets. So you can just drop things in you can kind of piecemeal things in there if you want to. So now that I've got that taken care of, this is already loaded. So what that's going to do is it's going to transpose a lot of CD text information to metadata. And I never even have to, do I have workflow for comparing old versions, capturing new analog? Hey, Steve. Yeah, we're going to get to the analog stuff in a second video. I'm kind of focusing on in-the-box workflows because this can pertain to people that capture in another software or another session and then just use WaveLab to finalize, which I know is popular, or people that are working 100% in the box, which is a very valid way to work, especially if you're stuck in your home studio. But revisions are a big part of it. I'll show you how I would handle a in-the-box revision because it's a lot of similarities. Anyways, I never have to even look at this metadata box unless when I'm explaining it to other people, because this is just kind of preloaded with a new montage and it's just there. And anytime there's CD text, it's transposing that to metadata. And this is set up. You can kind of tweak some things to your liking if it's not right. Obviously, I have mastered by me. You can add the artwork, which I tend to do only when I'm rendering the MP3s. Even though WAV files can contain artwork, very few programs can display it, and sometimes it can cause more problems than it solves. But this is where you would add the cover artwork. There's other metadata fields. We have the AXML chunk. People often wonder and think that they need to put their ISRC codes in their master files, and you can argue whether you do or don't. I like to just do it so I can tell the clients that it's done because it will be done. It's the truth. They'll find out that when they upload to DistroKid or CD Baby that they have to manually re-enter this information, and it's just the way it is. But I think there's value in having the metadata in the master files. But there's two places to embed ISRC codes. We have the ID3 tab, and if you scroll down or up, you'll see that I'm telling it to grab the CD text ISRC code and put it in the ID3 metadata. That's one place. But there's another place called the AXML chunk, and this is what the EBU has been trying to push as a standard for ISRC embedding, and maybe it is a standard by now, but this is a second place where the ISRC can be embedded. And so this tells it to go to both places, and this looks like a lot of gibberish. It's part of my preset. It's also listed here in factory presets. If you go down, you can choose that, and that will populate just that. It might wipe out other things. So I suggest just grabbing my preset called JP Start, putting it in there. Then you got all this stuff. And this is the basics. Works for 99.9% of projects. And again, I never have to look at it except for explaining things to people using WaveLab, or again, just to add that artwork, which takes about 3 seconds. So now let's get to some fun stuff. Working on the sounds. As I mentioned, there's meters up here. WaveLab has a number of places to insert effects. And when you first open WaveLab as a new user, it might look like this. And you have this master section, and that's tempting to put plugins there because it's kind of the low-hanging fruit. It's a very obvious place to put effects. But the thing about the master section that I'm not particularly fond of is the master section affects the entire piece of software. So if I put an EQ in this, if I put an EQ in this master section, it's affecting this whole montage, but it's also affecting this WAV file if I play it. So that's not particularly good. That confuses a lot of new users because they're used to having all the plugins within a particular project, whereas the master section is for the whole piece of software. And some people are okay with that, especially older users of WaveLab. I think for new users, it really confuses them because it affects whatever file you're playing, and it's also not automatically saved and reloaded with your project, which is a little bit unfortunate. There are ways to save all these settings and reload them, but you have to do it in a separate step. A little bit of automatic stuff can happen, but for me, it leaves room for human error. If I'm working quickly, I'm going to forget to save something or load something. Something's going to go wrong. So I don't use the master section at all, but it does have a place, again, to insert, I think, up to 12 plugins now. It has a resampling section, which I'm not going to use. You always want to keep the faders at 0 dB because that's your reference to the outside world. In fact, I have mine locked, so I can't even accidentally move them. And there's a final effects section, which is handy because let's say you are using the master section to resample the 44.1. You're probably going to want to insert a true peak limiter and dithering after that. But I'm going to show you how that you don't even need to use this stuff. One thing that it does have, which I do use and is amazing, is playback processing. Now, playback processing are plugin slots that only happen on playback, if you can imagine that. It's a good place to insert additional metering if you have a favorite meter plugin that you like. So as you can see, I have the Clarity M plugin. Now, this is a plugin that just talks to the Clarity M is a hardware meter. Most mastering engineers probably are familiar. So this plugin is talking to my hardware meter on my desktop. But you could also insert a plug-in meter if you have a favorite one. You can also insert SonarWorks. It's a popular room correction and headphone correction software. And the cool thing about the playback processing slots is that plugins in this slot, there's 3 of them, plugins in this section do not get displayed on the metering. So they don't influence the internal metering of WaveLab, which is ideal. You know, if you are using SonarWorks to fix your low end in your headphones or speakers, you don't want that to show up on your frequency analysis. And the other great thing is it's not part of any rendered files. So I'm sure people have done this. You have SonarWorks turned on to correct problems. And then you go to render your files and you realize that you accidentally had SonarWorks on. And now suddenly you're EQing your files through SonarWorks, and that's a problem. So playback processing is a great way to a great place to put additional metering and room correction type stuff. WaveLab also comes with an encoder checker, which is a way to check, MP3 and AAC encoding. If you want to get a feel for how your master is going to sound on Apple Music or Spotify, things like that. And again, there's no danger of rendering files through that audio. It's a really safe place to put stuff like metering and things like that. So I do use the playback processing slots. There's a thing called speaker configuration. Because I don't use it, I can't tell you much about it. You may have to look at that on your own, but there is a way to have different speaker configurations, levels, and routing. But as you can see, I keep this hidden. And so there's a few settings in the master section. I use this setting that restores the last master section configuration at the next startup. And I do this because I don't use it for any actual effects. I want it to start up clean at 0 with no effects. I only want my Clarity M to be there. So basically, I never have to manage this. Every time I open WaveLab, Clarity M is there. If I was a SonarWorks user, I could keep it so that every time I open WaveLab, SonarWorks is loaded with my settings, and it's kind of set it and forget it. So there are some settings in here to be aware of. I like to restore at last, restore last configuration at next startup, rearrange, rearrange. You can control which things you can even see. So I could actually hide the speaker configuration, which I probably should do because I just don't use it. So you can show or hide some of these areas as well if you just don't want to see them. But really what I do is, and there's a button here to reset the master section. If you screw things up, you can press this button. It totally clears it back to default. But I actually want my Clarity M plugin in there with my little preset. Not much there. Anyways, what I actually do is totally hide the master section. So I have a little workspace layout that you can get to by going to JP Start, and you can organize you can find where your computer stores them if you want to just load that. Anyway, I have it set up in such a way that the master section is fairly compact, and it's also floating. So I can use Control and the letter M, and that's a shortcut that I programmed, but I like to just toggle the master section if I ever do need to see it. Occasionally I may need to just do something quick. I may need to verify that Clarity M is inserted. But mostly I hide it because that gives me more screen real estate. I like to have as much screen real estate as possible. That's why earlier I went into this menu and hid the transport because I have my settings. I hid the file tabs, all this stuff. I'm getting a lot of screen real estate by hiding this stuff. So master section just goes away because I don't like using it for effects. Again, I know that it's a really tempting place to start adding effects because it's one of the first things you see. In fact, I think when you first load WaveLab, it has Master Rig loaded up, which is a nice plugin from Steinberg. It's very modular. You can add a limiter, EQ. It's a very powerful plugin, but I'm going to suggest using it in the montage instead of in the master section. But if you're seeing Master Rig here, in my opinion, you may want to remove it by right-clicking because I prefer to manage all my effects within the montage itself. So master section, cool thing, just not going to use it. So I'm going to hide that and make sure there's no effects in there. And again, make sure that when I look at my faders, they're set to 0 dB and they're locked, so I can't even accidentally change them. Because if I were to change it to the level and render, that could affect my output level. So I like to just keep things as safe as possible and hide that. So let's get back to the montage. I think a question came in about lanes. Maybe if Steve wants to elaborate on that. WaveLab doesn't really have lanes. It has audio tracks, and then there isn't a volume for this whole track. You have to manage the volume of clips of each song by using the clip envelope, kind of like this. But there isn't an overall level for the whole track. I think that's what he's asking about. But basically, I basically consider that each clip has its own lane, but the tracks itself do not. And for me, that works just fine. So let's get into where I do add effects. Again, by default, you may have a situation that looks like this. One thing that is new to WaveLab 10 is the inspector. In previous versions of WaveLab, it was called the Effects tab. The inspector is just a new name and some additional features. And by default, it's kind of mated in here with the master section. And because I'm an old WaveLab user, I didn't prefer this layout when it first came out, even though you might. So I have it kind of docked. I was able to, you can float things and you can use this button to dock windows elsewhere. WaveLab is pretty flexible with the layout and how you can customize it. But basically, as you can see, I have the inspector parked up here because that's where the effects tab used to be. That's just where I'm used to it being. So inspector is where you insert your effects. Now within the montage, there are 3 places to insert effects. And I'm going to go through that right now. So I'm going to just hide the master section because I just, again, don't care for it. It's useful for some things, but not what we're going to get into. So the 3 areas to insert effects are clip, track, and output. And I'm going to talk about track first because I don't use it. I just want to clarify that track effects are not for your CD tracks or your album tracks or anything like that. Track effects are for what you see here, I have track 1 and track 2. So if I wanted to put a plugin on track 1, it would only affect every other song. And yeah, the inspector does have a gain thing as well for each track and clip. But anyways, the track effect is something I really don't use because that's only going to affect every other song. So we're just kind of rule that out. I just wanted to clarify that it doesn't have anything to do with CD tracks. So just kind of get that out of your head. Clip effects are where you can apply plugins to each song or clip. Some mastering programs call it an object or an item. In WaveLab, it's called a clip. And basically, that's typically each song. Now, we can split songs into multiple clips. If, for instance, you wanted the intro of a song to have a different plugin chain than the rest of it, you could split that song into 2 clips and have a different plugin chain. But that's pretty rare. So clip areas where you insert plugins that are just going to be on that song in particular. So as you can see, when I play the first song, this song is going through that EQ. When I play the second song, it's not. So that's that. The output section is something I also use quite a bit. This is kind of like your master fader that you would expect in a normal DAW. The output is kind of the last effects area. And to go backwards, the master section, I refer to it as the global master section because that is affecting the entire piece of software. No matter what you're playing goes through there. And there are ways to disable it. If you look down here, you can make it so that the master section is the global master section is bypassed. But again, just kind of forget about that. The output section is like your montage master output. Anything in this area is every song is going to pass through it. So if I put a plug in there, you can see that each song is passing through it. So it kind of goes in order. Clip effects are first because they're right on the clip. Passes through the track effects, which I don't particularly use. And the last step is the output effects section. And that's where I would typically put something like a limiter or anything that I want to affect the entire project. Sometimes you may get a revision note from your client that says, sounds great, but can the overall album just be a little brighter? And while you could go song by song and make each song a little brighter, if it's more of a global thing, you could, put a plugin in this section and just make the whole record a little brighter in one easy pass. So just remember that there's 3 places to put effects. So clip, track, and output. I'm going to clear these effects so we can start clean now and start showing you some things. One thing that I do, again, these songs look fairly close to the same level. One handy little trick for in-the-box workflows especially is the meta normalizer. So I'm going to go to Process tab. Again, this is called the Ribbon tab, where a lot of great features are hiding. And I'm going to click on Meta Normalizer. And again, if you're using my settings, it's Shift and the letter M brings up the loudness Meta Normalizer. And I have some presets in here. And I'm going to choose JP Start ITB for in the box. And what this does, and this is something I made up for my workflow, is it's going to basically set all the songs to the same loudness, but not the same integrated loudness. What it's going to do is it's going to match the top of the loudness range of each song to the same level. So basically, the loudest part of each song is going to hit your effects, your mastering chain at the same level, because this is not a particularly dynamic album, but in my opinion, you kind of want the loudest parts of each song to hit basically the same level. And again, this is a starting point. This is not an end point. This is just something I do before I get started to help me out, get all the songs on the same page. So I'm going to normalize the top of loudness range of each song to -16 LUFS. And the reason I use top of loudness range is because if I have a very dynamic song that starts quiet and gets loud, if I use the integrated loudness, which we can choose, entire clip, that might not sound very natural to the ear. So in my opinion, the most natural to the ear way to normalize each clip before starting is this top of loudness range. I don't care about peaks because I'm going to manage that later with you know, a final limiter. So I don't care about peaks right now. I want all the clips, and I want to exclude any audio effects. I don't have any effects going, but I want this to happen just to the level of the raw level of the clips themselves, not with any plugin influence. So I chose -16 because to me, if I'm using any plugins that simulate analog gear, like a tape simulator, that's kind of their sweet spot. And you might find that a different number works better for you, and you can enter that in. You might find that maybe -18 is better. Anyways, for me, -16 is great. And when I press apply, watch what happens. It's analyzing the files, and it didn't have to do much. These mixes are kind of in a nice sweet spot already, but I'll do it one more time, pressing apply. And this is non-destructive. It just changed the level of all the clips. I probably should have picked a more dramatic batch of files to choose from, but if we go to the clips tab now, one other thing that I didn't show you before is in the clips tab, we have gain settings, and you can change these manually, of course, by double clicking and typing stuff, and you'll see the actual waveform change. If I increase the gain by 3, you'll see it go up. But what the meta normalizer does is it changes the gain levels non-destructively, which is great because it's not making copies of files. Just a really great way to work. And it adjusted them all a little bit. You know, some, you know, not very much. You know, it really depends how quiet or loud the files came in to start with. But you can see that it adjusted them all a little bit so that if I were to listen to these by ear, the loudest parts of each song are basically hitting the same, and it's a great starting point. And the reason I wanted to show you this menu is because there's 2 places to adjust clip gain, pre-gain and post-gain. Pre-gain is adjusting the clip level before any clip effects. Post-gain is adjusting the gain after any clip effects. So I like to do my initial adjustments pre-gain, pre-clip gain. But again, if you've dialed in a bunch of plugins and you just want to increase the level and not, you know, because if you adjust the level pre-gain, then you're feeding more signal into a compressor or a dynamics processor. If you've got that all perfectly dialed in and you just want to turn up the clip overall, you could do it with the post-gain, and that'll happen after all your plugins. But anyways, pre-gain is where the meta normalizer does it. I think it's a great place for that to happen. So now let's talk about plugins. I'm going to readjust my layout here. It's kind of shrunken down because of my preferred layout, but the inspector does have a fader for each clip, so I can also use this fader. There's a lot of places to change your gains, but there's a lot of places for things to go wrong. So that's why you'll notice with my preset, this particular fader is set to 0 and it's locked. And it's kind of small because it's not exactly how it was meant to be. There's panning. But I keep this locked in at 0. I like to manage my clip gain with the actual numbers here. I could do -6 and it gets small. I like that you can see the waveform changing in real time. So anyways, this is how the meta normalizer said was good. And back to the inspector. This is where we can load individual plugins. This is my list of all of the plugins I have on my system. There's a recently used column. There's a favorites column, so that, you know, back in your preferences, which is over an hour ago now, if you go to plugins, you can check the crown button. If you check the crown box, that's what makes your plugins show up in your favorites slot. And also related to that, while I'm thinking of it, some people get stuck with this. So I'm going to go to plugins. Clarity M is made by TC Electronic, and I had to go in and manually add this to the play column. You can see that if you go down vertically, there's a box for play. That means it's going to appear in the playback effects, because as you'll notice, there's not a lot of plugins that show up in the playback effect slots. That's because only a few of them are allowed to by default. There's usually some metering and things like that. So if you want something in particular to be available here, you just have to go into the plugins preferences and select the play checkbox, and then it will appear there. So that's how I got ClarityM to appear there. I've had some people ask me that they can't get certain plugins to load there, and that's how you do that. So you can add plugins however you like to add them. You can go one at a time. Let's see. Studio EQ. Of course, WaveLab comes with Master Rig, which is great. It's like a plugin with a bunch of plugins inside of it, EQ, compression. But if you're like me, you probably have some favorite plugins and also a workflow established that you just kind of know is a good starting point. So I have plugin chains that I've already created. So I can go to this little icon and I can load a plugin chain. And for me, this is a good in the box plugin chain. It's kind of a lot of plugins. I usually strip some things out that aren't needed. But you know, this is a nice little plugin chain for a song, and they're already loaded to, you know, I don't have any EQ dialed in, but I have some common points already set to go with some of these plugins, some common problem areas, and just some of my favorite starting point settings. So you can, however you like to work, you can dial up a plugin chain, and then you can save it here with this icon. You can press the save button and save it however, you can call it whatever you want to call it. You can save it wherever you want to save it. I keep mine in my WaveLab folder, so it's there if I go to transfer it to my other systems. But that's how you load a plugin chain on a clip. Now remember, this is just happening on this clip. So if I go to this song, it's not on any of these songs. You can see in the clip, in the inspector, now there's no plugins visible. But when I select that first song, you can see all the plugins I've loaded on it. And also one thing that, especially if you're working in the box, you may want to load in some kind of limiter to get, because you know you're going to need a limiter eventually. So I have a special chain for, you know, a limiter starting point. I like to use a limiter followed with a true peak limiter separately. I really like this particular peak limiter because it has a delta mode and you can hear just the true peaks that it's catching. And you'll notice I'm not doing any dithering. That's going to all be managed later when we render the file. So basically I'm just dialing in my level, and I'm looking over here, my LUFS. This is not super loud. If I needed more level, I could increase the output gain of this compressor. I don't want to get too into mastering itself. This is more about workflows, but as you can see, this song is -10, so that's in the ballpark perhaps. So again, the output section is your global. This is where I put my final limiter personally. If I need to drive more signal into the limiter, I can do it with the clip envelope. And again, you can have that be after your clip effects chain. So this wouldn't affect my compression on the clip. It would only affect the level going into the limiter on the montage output. So that's something to consider. That's why I can kind of get away with using a limiter. My final limiter is on the output. Some people may like to put a limiter specific to each song, and that's fine too. There's more than one way to work. That's just kind of how I develop my workflow. But let's say, so that's one song. How do we get effects on all the other songs? Well, you can go one by one, which is maybe the proper old school way of doing it. You could load your effects chain and figure out what the song needs. However, if you want kind of a quick way of, let's say that the album, and I know that this album does, all the songs sound very similar. Similar instrumentation, frequencies. So let's say I just want a quick starting point. I can copy this whole effects chain, go into menu. I can copy a single effect if I want to. I can select it and just press copy. But if I want to copy all of them, I can choose copy all. And I also have a shortcut program for that, as you can imagine. With Option Command C, we'll copy all those effects. And WaveLab 10 has a new thing that lets me paste an effects chain to a bunch of selected clips at one time. Now I could manually select them by holding Command, but if you want to work fast, that's kind of a slow way to go. So what I would do is, there's a cool little feature here in the Clips menu, and I have a program. I keep saying that I have a shortcut programmed, but you can inverse your selection. So if you have one clip selected, you can run this little option, and that deselects your selected clip and inverts the selection. So now all my other clips are selected. And again, the program shortcut I didn't care for, so I changed it to Control-I for invert selection. So now all the other songs are selected, and then I can use my, well, I won't use the shortcut so you can see. I can go to the inspector, and I can go to menu, and I can choose paste to selected clips. And now that is going to paste that effects chain to all the selected clips. It takes a minute because it's doing it to all the clips at one time. But now when I skip from clip to clip, you can see they all have that same effects chain. And now I can kind of go per song and say, you know, this song needs a little more low end. And then I can go to this song and say this one needs a little more high end. I'm really dumbing things down for the sake of speed here, but I just want to iterate that clip effects are a big part of what makes WaveLab awesome, and I'm a little surprised when I see new users don't realize that you can even do clip effects. So it's basically your per song effects. So I'm trying to see if Harold has any new questions. I'm somewhat close to wrapping things up and rendering this file, but a few more things I want to go over. I don't even know if anyone's watching, but this will be recorded so it can live on YouTube forever, or till they decide to take it down. But so just be aware that you can have per song effects. You know, maybe not every song needs all these effects. So you can right click and remove a plugin. You can of course rearrange the order. What I really like about WaveLab 2 is the plugin. I'm struggling to think of the name, but it's the plugin window. It's basically tabbed, so you can rearrange the order of your plugins right here. You can add a new plugin if you want to add one just for this particular song. You do have to kind of watch. Oh, this plugin has an update. You do have to watch that. It'll tell you at the top of the plugin window which song you're adjusting. This is She Ain't Your Baby. And it'll also tell you in the inspector which one you're adjusting. See, especially when you're just getting used to WaveLab, you do want to be a little careful so you know which song you're adjusting. I have it set so that if a plugin chain window is open, it switches to that chain for me. As you can see, I'm switching from track 4 track 4 has a high frequency adjustment on that one. Track 3 has a low frequency adjustment. So that is a good clue of, you know, which clip are you actually adjusting, because I've seen some new users think they're adjusting one song, but they're adjusting a different one. You'll get used to this as you get familiar with WaveLab, but I just wanted to point out that it does tell you which clip effects chain you are adjusting at the very top. And again, this is all going through my output effects, and I can decide how much limiting I need or don't need, and for the whole record. Again, we'll discuss dithering when we get to rendering. If for some reason you do want this intro to have a special EQ, maybe it needs to have a lo-fi intro, which probably would be done in mastering or mixing, but you could do it in mastering. You can kind of do a crossfade here, and now this little beginning part has its own effects chain. You know, I could do AM radio thing, kind of roughing that in. Not that great, but I could do a lo-fi thing just for the intro, and then when it kicks into the big part of the song, you can fine tune. That wasn't a great place to put the edit point, but you can fine tune the edit point and the size of it. So that's pretty cool. So as you can see, the intro is playing through this effects chain. When it switches to that next section, it's gone, but I can see what this is doing. So It's not, I don't do it too often, but once in a while I will section off part of a song and give it its own effects chain. Now you do have to manually manage things. So let's say you want to change the compressor setting on that whole song and you do it on the first part, you would have to go to the other one. I don't know of any mastering software that has that part figured out yet, but just be aware that you can split clips. I'm just going to check my notes here before I move on, make sure I didn't skip anything that I wanted to cover. I do want to get, before I get into rendering though, I want to get into reference tracks. But basically, you know, you're going to just listen through. One cool, WaveLab has a live spectrogram, which is nice. And I have it set up so it toggles into view or out of view. Again, the bit depth meter, we can see that this is processing at 64-bit floating point. We're going to address dithering later. But we can cycle through our meters. You know, we can see the integrated LUFS, short-term, momentary. And this meter does have some cool settings. You can set it to be what you think is the sweet spot. So this little box around the, you know, if you think minus 12 is your sweet spot for short-term LUFS, you can make it so that this box turns a certain color when it's above or below it or right in the middle of it. A lot of cool settings in the metering. Again, the metering alone is what is worth the price of WaveLab for me. I just love all the built-in metering. One thing that I don't want to say the name, but one thing that's great about WaveLab compared to a different mastering software is the loudness readings reset on each playback. So you see when I start a new playback, all these readings reset because this is important. You know, integrated loudness is a period of time, so you want each playback to be measured. And you don't want to have to manually hit reset on each playback. That gets really annoying. So every time you hit play, the integrated, all the LUFS readings are reset. And again, that time code is very handy for knowing where you're at in a particular track. Now I have it set to clip start, but I may change it to track start, which is going to be very, very much the same time, but slightly different because you can see the markers offset from the track. Let's get into the markers tab and just see if there's anything else I want to cover. You know, you can manually type in where markers are as well. Same with clips. You know, you can type in here if you wanted to move this, just the marker without the clip. Can't think of why I would want to do that, but markers I tend to drag around to find the sweet spot and things like that. Replacing a clip, I showed you that already. There is a little notes tab if you like to keep internal notes. Another useful thing I didn't talk about is the files tab. You know, I'm pretty good with file management, but some people aren't. If you want to know where a particular file is located, you can click on a clip and it will tell you where it is on your computer. Now mine are all nicely in the same folder, but if you need to know, and then you can also reveal it in the Finder. So you can right click and it will show you right on your system where the file is located. A handy little tip. But otherwise, I think I want to get into reference tracks. I'll see if Harold has any new stuff. Nope. So we'll get into reference tracks. Reference tracks are a new thing to WaveLab 10. And I've already said a couple of reasons why I like them. But I have a shortcut in my settings, which is Control-Option-Command-R. Creates a reference track, and you know it's a reference track because it has a big R in it. And also with my shortcuts, I can use Shift and the up and down arrows to reorganize these tracks. If for some reason you do want to move clips around, you can go to the Clips tab and you can choose if it's on track 1 or 2 of your session. Sometimes this is useful for when you have to rearrange the track order, but you want to keep the files staggered. You can use this little menu to figure out where what track each clip is on. But to make a new reference track without the shortcut, you would just right click in the track header and Actually, you press, I use the shortcut so often I don't know how to do it manually. So you want to add a track, and you can choose if it's a stereo track, mono track, reference track. I've already added the reference track. The interesting thing with reference tracks is, well, for one, you don't hear them unless you either solo them with the ear button, the listen button, or you can route them to a different output. So let's say, I'm trying to think of an example. Well, one new thing with WaveLab, the latest maintenance update, is you can right-click on this track and you can copy clips to a different track. And I can copy these clips to a reference track. And I want to do all clips. And I can copy, and this takes a minute because it's doing the plugins. I've actually requested that maybe there's an option to copy the clips without the plugins, because I want to compare the raw versions without any effects to what I'm doing. So I'm going to do that with just one. So I'm having to manually remove the plugins from each clip. So this may be something you want to do when you get your montage laid out, but not with any effects inserted. I'll just do the first three. So the reason the waveforms on the reference track are kind of grayed out is because they're there, but if I play this session, I'm not hearing the reference track. I'm still just hearing the normal track that I wanted to work on as usual. But if I press the ear button, that is going to let me hear this reference track. And the nice thing about this is it's not going to pass through any, it's showing me, but I'm not hearing it. The reference track is not going to pass through any plugins that are in your montage output or your master section if you don't want to. So you're not hearing the reference track going through your processing. You're hearing directly just this file without any plugins, any effects. So that's a nice thing that reference tracks are for. Another thing that I've used reference tracks for, I forgot to make a mock-up, but sometimes clients will send you a mock-up of how they want the transitions to be from song to song. They'll send you a MP3 or a wave of the entire session, the entire master as one file, and you are expected to match your mastering to that. It happens somewhat often. Anyways, you can put that reference mock-up on this reference track, and then you can kind of visually align your masters to that. Now mine are already aligned because I copied them, but let's say they weren't. Then I can kind of zoom in on the reference file and match it up, kind of down to the sample if you want to really get in there. WaveLab lets you zoom in incredibly close. So I could get pretty close and be like, yep, that's pretty much where they had it in their sequence. That way you know that your assembled master is matching their mock-up. But the other cool thing with reference tracks, you can listen to it. If you just have a simple setup, you can press the listen button and hear, the unmastered version, or again, the mix engineer's reference version. It could also just be a song that they like. Maybe they sent you a wave of a different song that you're trying to match it to. You can put anything you want in these reference tracks. You can even have it be a digital input from like a stream of something. Anyways, you can also send reference tracks directly to a different hardware output. So these are all my hardware outputs. These top three, these would feed my analog mastering chain, which we'll talk about in another video. But I can just select raw output. Raw output is routed directly to my monitor controller digitally. And now when I'm playing this session, I don't even have to have this ear selected. I can just listen as normal. And I can toggle right on my monitor controller if I'm hearing the top two tracks of what I'm doing, or I can press the other channel output and listen to the reference track. So some people might prefer to manage this on their monitor controller, especially when we start integrating analog gear. So reference tracks are just a great way to have other stuff. And you'll also notice that reference tracks are excluded from a lot of things. If you move stuff, the reference track doesn't move. If you use the CD wizard, the CD wizard's great. If you use the CD wizard when there's a reference track, these clips aren't included, so you're not going to get double markers or anything like that. You're just going to get markers for the actual clips of your session. So I think that's all I had to say about reference tracks right now, but that's reason alone enough for me to upgrade from 9.5 to 10 as reference tracks. I guess, it didn't occur to me how many times I get a mock-up of a full album that the client wants me to kind of recreate with my master files, the crossfades or any spacings and stuff like that. And I used to have to do that on just a normal track and just mute it and make sure I deleted it so it wouldn't be part of the renders, all those sorts of things. So reference tracks are just a really cool thing. I'm actually going to delete the reference track just so I don't have to look at it. You can right click on the track header and do a number of things, remove it. So let's get into rendering now. Let's say that I have this sounding good. I've got all the songs feeling good on the same page. I like to just kind of jump around and listen. I use the meters to sort of confirm what I'm hearing, but WaveLab makes it really easy to just jump around and find again, I should have picked a more diverse group of songs or dynamic, but lets you skip around and make sure everything's sounding good. And if a certain song needs a little more of this or that, you can go into the clip effects and figure out what that needs. If it needs a little more highs. And again, all these plugin settings are stored within the montage. So if I close it, another great thing I love about WaveLab is right-clicking. You can see all your recent projects. And all these settings are just automatically reloaded. If I go back to the inspector, all the plugins are there. Just real nice. And to go back to the master section, that's where it gets a little iffy because, for one, the master section only processes the whole playback stream, but it also requires you to save and load those plugins separately, and it's just not, in my opinion, ideal. So I'm going to actually remove some plugins to speed up the rendering times. I know this is not ideal, but just bear with me for a moment. I just want the renders to go as quickly as possible. So basically just ignore what I'm doing. And there could be a faster way to do this. It's just not something I normally do. So I'm going to do it the slow way. Removing all the clip effects. So obviously you wouldn't do this. I'm just doing it to speed up render times. Because now we're going to say that everything sounds great and it's time to get something that we can send to our clients. And again, I'm approaching this from the perspective of a mastering studio working with a client where they're going to want changes. So that's why I do all my fades in the montage non-destructively, because you just never know when they're going to ask for a little tweak here and there. And that's totally common. I'm going to leave one plugin just so that there's some bit depth stuff happening. So let's say I'm ready to render. Everything sounds good. Again, I may have programmed this myself, but there is a shortcut to get to the render ribbon tab. This is a really important tab once you are ready to move on. You can, of course, select it, but I find myself lost in menus, and I might just want to press the letter A twice. That gets me to the render ribbon tab. Now, you can render a lot of different things. When I do my initial render, these are my preferred settings. I want to render the entire montage as one long file. And we've talked about this a little bit, but I thought I maybe made this up, but a lot of mastering engineers render the entire montage as one file because you want to lock in that processing at the highest sample rate and bit depth. And it also helps things when we have tracks that overlap. Let's say you have two tracks that connect in pretty much any software, and it's not the software's fault, it's usually the plugin's fault. If you try to render a file of each track and there's plugin processing happening, that it's highly likely that when you assemble those files in a media player, submit for distribution, that you're going to have a click or a pop at that transition. And I basically figured this out the hard way, because when I would make a DDP, it would be fine when there's effects running live. But when I would render waves of each track and songs overlap, sometimes I would get a little click or a pop, and it was driving me crazy. So I thought, well, what's different about a DDP? A DDP is actually one continuous render. Um, when you think about it, it's a single render, and the DDP information has the track breakups. So I came up with this process, and I was surprised to see some other mastering people do the same thing already, and probably for the same reason. So what I like to do is render the whole montage as one file. We can render things like a selected audio range. Sometimes when a client has a quick tweak, they'll say, can you adjust the song space, when they've already heard the master, of course. And I got to fix that. I don't know what happened here. There's also a good exercise, as we move things around. I think this was an overlap at one point. As you move things around manually, the very last thing you want to do before rendering, in my opinion, is requantize. So I go to the CD wizard, requantize so that my markers are right on a CD frame, because my next render process is going to force CD frame compatibility anyways because of how WaveLab works. So you might as well just quantize it yourself and be aware of where all the markers are. And also, as a reminder, I press the home key to get back to the start. Make sure my first marker is truly at 0.00. You can go to the markers tab and verify that. It's at 0 milliseconds. Shift and the right parenthesis, which is also the 0 key at the top. So basically, shift and the parentheses let you quickly check your track marker placement. So everything looks good. As we mentioned, these two songs are going to overlap, and I decided that the marker is going to be best on the downbeat. So when you skip to that song, it starts right there. It's not going to be pretty, but when you overlap songs, you got to pick the least awkward spot. So my markers are good, but like I mentioned, we can do, you can render just selected audio ranges. Sometimes that's handy when you're tweaking transitions and you don't want to send them a whole master quite yet. So you can just select a little range and just render that little chunk and say, does this sound right? And then when it does, you render a new master. You can render a number of things, but my first rendering is the whole montage. And one great thing, I think this was new in WaveLab 9.5. And again, if I could never go back to not having this, but render presets are extremely useful because it takes all these little settings and allows you to save it as a preset. So you can get everything set in one go. Because WaveLab is interesting. You have to tell it the bit depth that you want the file to be, and you have to insert your own dither of some kind. It's not going to dither it for you in the background, none of that stuff. It's very matter of fact. So this is where I'm going with this. So I'm going to render a full file at 32-bit floating point 96. And even though WaveLab is processing at 64, the sample rate converter I like to use is still limited to 32-bit float, so nothing to lose sleep over. But I'm going to render a 32-bit float wave of this whole session, this whole montage at 96K, which is the native sample rate that it's at. So I just use the first option. One cool thing with any WaveLab preset menu is if you notice a little line under the character, this one, there's a line under the number 1. If I have this menu open, I press the number 1, it chooses that preset. So that's a quick way to choose presets. In fact, we'll go back to plugins for a moment. Many plugins have preset menus within themselves. WaveLab has its own preset menu for plugins, so you could save this preset as something and name it. But what's really cool, and let me go to a plugin that has a lot of options, just for 2 reasons. Really like this Vertigo plugin, but as far as I know, this plugin manufacturer, there's not a way to save a default setting when you load this plugin. It always goes to its own default. Some plugins do have default setting options within them. I dialed in my favorite setting and I went to save as and named it and all that stuff. But when you look in this menu, you can see there's some factory ones that came with it. Mine is just called 00JP start. I like to start my presets with 00 because I can really easily, with my thumb, still kind of on the mouse, but with my thumb of my right hand, just press the letter 0, number 0, and it loads that preset, which is my kind of preferred starting point instead of the default one. So just be aware in any preset menu, you got these little lines under the character that lets you very quickly choose that preset. For me, it comes in really handy during rendering, but also handy for plugin presets. So that's a little preset menu. And again, you get lines that tell you if it's VST2 or VST3. I always use VST3 first when possible. Anyways, let's get to rendering. So I choose this initial render, which is the top one. And a couple things need to happen here. I need to tell it where to go. So I'm going to use the location field and tell it where to put this render. I'm going to choose select destination folder, and I can very quickly navigate to the project, and I'm going to make a folder called 96K renders. Now I have a little shortcut with a third-party app that just lets me press a shortcut, and because I do this all day, every day, it makes a folder called 96K renders, and that's where my initial render is going to live. So I've set that destination, and I also need to name it something. And it doesn't have to be anything official. I do some kind of abbreviation of the artist name and album title. So I would just call it something like that. And version 1. And again, everything else is set. The format box is already set, but let me just show you what is in there. You can render more than one format at a time. I'm not going to do that here, but you could render WAV and MP3, WAV and AIF, all sorts of things. But if you go to edit single format, here's what my preset is doing. It's rendering a WAV. It's rendering PCM. The channels are matching the input stream, which is stereo. The sample rate it's matching, because I'm not changing the sample rate here. The bit depth is 32-bit float. Metadata sounds important, but it's actually not for this particular thing. We manage the metadata another way. Anyways, all these settings are saved as a preset, which is saved inside the render preset. So it's like a preset within a preset. And anyways, that's what it's doing. So this whole render preset is telling it to do the whole montage as a 32-bit float wave and not changing the name. The naming scheme is really awesome for eventually, but right now I want this file name and I want it to be unchanged. Some options in the render. And again, this is all saved in that render preset. So this is something that happens in a matter of seconds. I'm just explaining it slowly. I want to bypass the master section because that's that global master section. And even though there's no plugins in there, I just like to be safe and bypass it. I don't care about master section preset, not using it. I don't want to do any fade ins and outs. I've got that taken care of. Reverb tail is not really, I don't really use reverb or mastering. It's not really applicative here, but I do want to copy the markers. And even though you may not technically need one for this process, we need to create an image and cue sheet. And we want to create an audio montage from the result. So basically, when I render this, it's going to recreate the montage automatically with all the markers, all the data that I've done. It's going to make a new one for me, but all the processing is locked in. Open resulting file, that's more for when you're rendering your tracks. So basically, these are the settings I use for the options. And again, it's all part of this one preset. You can do it in less than a second. So yeah, so when I'm ready, I just select that. I just slowly wanted to explain everything, what all options are. But select that, tell it where it's going, tell it what it's called, and this should go pretty quick, I think, because I have that one plugin on just for sake. I'm going to grab a sip of water here, and then we'll see what happens when it's done. And what happens when it's done is it's going to, like I said, recreate that montage with all the everything carries over. So my whole point here is you only have to enter in the metadata, the CD text, the whatever. You only have to do things one time, and all that gets mirrored no matter what format you make, no matter what. So it saves you a lot of time to get it taken care of up front. Now this is obviously no plugin, so it's going to look quiet. It's not necessarily how it's going to sound. It's more of a workflow video. So what we got here is an untitled montage, but all the audio was rendered. All the markers are back. You can see the markers. If I go to the CD tab, all the CD text is there. The ISRC codes are there. Everything's great. Markers are where they need to be. If I play this transition, it's totally seamless. There's no glitch or tick or pop. So it sounds totally seamless. We do need to name this montage. Again, I'm using a Stream Deck. That's how I normally do it, but I do have a preset that lets you, again, I use shortcuts, so I'm going to be slow here, but I like to copy the original montage name, copy to clipboard without extension. Now I can do that in one click by pressing Control-N. Brings up this box. I'm copying the name of that montage without the extension because I'm going to use it here. I'm going to go Command-S to save, paste that in. You'll notice that it's conveniently saving the montage right next to the rendered file, which is where I would want it. I do change this to 2496. I remove the underscore. To me, the underscore just tells me that's the master montage with all the plugins. This is the rendered version. And again, the montages are bit depth agnostic, but I put 24 because I'm going to load in a 24-bit dither myself. So I basically just renamed it slightly different. And again, it goes, you don't have to touch anything. It just goes right where it should go. It's really fast. So now I've got this montage. So all I have to do is add my dither plugin, and I do that in the output of the montage. So I can do this quickly by pressing the letter E and the letter F and loading my 24-bit dither. So it's really quick to add a dither on the output of the montage. And WaveLab also comes with, where is it here now? The mbit plus dithering. This is a very good dithering plugin made by Isotope. It comes with WaveLab. I just personally prefer this other one, so I have it set up as a preset so I can load it in a matter of less than a second. It's dialed in how I like it to be, 24-bit. So you'll notice if I were to bypass, there's a bypass button up here for all the plugins in that section, so I can bypass them all in one go if I want to. If you'll notice, without that dither, and I hit play, it's floating point audio, which is how I want it to be because I'm going to downsample this to 44.1 eventually. So I always want to keep it at the highest bit depth possible. But when I activate this dither, we do have 20. It's telling me that the audio is 24-bit, which is how I would want it to be for rendering. So at this point, I could render a wave, 24-bit, 96K wave of each track. But I tend to not send the high-res stuff to my clients until they approve it. I like to give them something a little simpler to approve. So we're just going to let this montage kind of sit for a while. And this is, I already showed you this at the start of the video, but I'm going to externally sample rate convert this file. You might like Sericon, you might like RX. You could even use the batch processor of WaveLab, which can sound very good. It's just my habit. So I'm selecting that full render that I did, not the original files, not anything else. This is that full render. You can see that it's a short album, but it's 23 minutes long. Not sure what happened there, but selecting that file, and I'm going to let RX. So again, I got shortcuts to name these folders. I have to make a new folder called 44.1K renders because the file is going to have the same name, but of course you can't have two files with the same name in the same folder. So I make a separate folder for 44.1 renders, and this is going to downsample that full render for me. And in the meantime, I can go back to WaveLab, and I can't really do much until that resampling is done. So I'll see what's going on in the real world for a moment. So yeah, if you're not familiar with Stream Deck, it's a little thing that you put on your desktop. I think gamers use it a lot. It's good for shortcuts. I use it for combining shortcuts in WaveLab. So I can have a couple of shortcuts that I use in series and then program Stream Deck to just do them in the press of one button. It's also good for lesser used shortcuts that you might not remember. If you use a shortcut every 3 weeks, you might not remember it, but you can just have a button on your desk. So Stream Deck is great for that. Anyway, so this file is resampled. I can close RX. And speaking of that, so here is where I'll do it the slow way and the fast way. Again, I'm going to copy the name of this montage, and I'm going to use the custom montage duplicate. So this is how we get a perfect recreation of the 96K. And remember, this would normally be mastered and probably look like a ridiculous blob. But I just didn't want to wait for the plugins to process. So custom montage duplicate is how we get an exact recreation of the montage, but at a lower sample rate. So we can eventually render our tracks with all the metadata and everything's good to go. So again, what I do is I copy the name of the montage and I bring up this window called Create Customized Audio Montage Duplicate. And I have a shortcut program for that, of course. Command and I think it's the backslash right under the delete key, right above the return key. So if you're using my settings, that's there. The slow way to get to this is to go to File, New, Audio Montage from Current File, Duplicate, Recreate, Customize Duplicate, that's what we want. So that's the very slow way to do what I'm about to do. And then as you see, it also brings up that menu. But if you use my shortcuts, you can go Control-N, Command backslash, or if you use the Stream Deck, you can do all that in the press of one button, which is what I do. So one more time, just pressing my Stream Deck, and it did both of those things in one command. So now I have to point WaveLab to that new file I externally converted. So again, I use this little folder menu, select folder. I like this little app that helps me get there really quickly. So now I've selected the path of the converted file. Press OK. So now I have another version of the montage that's perfectly in sync. Everything's great. But if you look down here, the sample rate is 44.1. And my dither is still there to 24-bit. I do need to name it, so I can go to this montage, copy the name, go to this one, and I would save this perhaps as 2444. So at this point, I could render my 24-bit waves, 2441. I've been delivering that to clients because most distributors can accept that now. Now, I still, of course, give them 16-bit 44.1 waves when the project is approved. But let's say I want to send these out to my client to listen to these waves of each track. I go back to the render presets and I have this all set up for you, 24-bit wave tracks. That changes all these settings in the render tab. And some of the changes are, instead of rendering the whole montage, we're going to render all regions, and we're going to tell WaveLab that a region is a CD track. So again, pretty simple. It's going to be a named file, and the names are going to come from the region name, which, as you can see, this is why it's really important to get your markers named correctly from the get-go. All my markers are perfectly named as to what the song title is. This is where the naming scheme is awesome. I have a numeric prefix naming scheme, so all that does is adds whatever the track number is, it adds like 0, 1 and a space in the song title. You can really customize this to your liking if you want, but for me, the naming scheme works well. For a number, as you can see, I got a bunch of naming schemes, and I'll go through what they're for in a moment. You can steal them from the description of this video on YouTube. So we have this particular render preset does the numeric prefix. It creates a 24-bit wave. You got to remember that WaveLab needs to know exactly what format you want, and you have to do that dithering yourself. So I still have this dither plugin loaded that carried over from the previous montage. And if you check the bit depth meter, it is indeed 24-bit audio. And some of the options that it does, I don't need it to open the file, although you could have it open the files to check. I don't need a lot of these things. I don't need the markers anymore. So that's basically what this render preset does. So now the last thing I need to do is tell it where to go. I don't want it to go to this path. And what I find myself doing is pressing Command F to get to the Files tab. I just copy this name. To me, this is a really useful name because it has the band name, some semblance of the album title, and the version number. And I'm just going to paste it into this path. And this is, again, why I love WaveLab, is this editable location field. It saves me so much time. So I'm going to change this path to 2444 Wave version 1. And I'm going to hit, you can press the Start Rendering button. I press Command and Return to start rendering. And now let's watch what happens in my project folder. I have wave files showing up. And they're perfectly named and numbered. And even the Mac Finder will show you a little bit of metadata. There's more metadata there. It's just that with wave files, many programs can't display it. But if I were to load this into an actual good metadata app, you can actually see that the ISRC codes are there, the track number, track totals there. So it's flush with metadata, which is great. So I also send out a DDP to my clients to approve because that's the preferred way for them to listen, because the DDP player can't screw up like a media player. So this is where I do save as. Shift and the letter S. I'm just going to change this to 1644, and I'm going to load my 16-bit dither in the output section because DDP has to be 16-bit. And I have a little shortcut to get the DDP rendering box open. And I use the shortcut so often that I forget where you even do it. Just use my shortcut. We could go to File, Tools. So you go to the File menu. There's probably a better way, but File, Tools, Write Audio brings up the same box pretty much. But I use the shortcut of Shift and the letter D twice, and it brings up this box. And again, the cool thing with WaveLab is I can use this drop-down menu as a starting point. This is the project I'm on, WaveLab's ITB. And I can just clear out this stuff and type in DDP and still version 1 and make sure there's no spaces after it. Now I'm rendering a DDP. Again, everything is all in sync in terms of timing, spacing. I only have to assemble it once and enter the data once. And now I've got DDP file set right in that same path. So that's great. And again, MP3s, clients like to have those for better or worse. I'm just in the habit of supplying them so they don't make them using some other means and have it sound bad. So again, I'll do Command Shift S to save as. I have a little shortcut to add for MP3 encode. It's from Floating Point Audio, so I change it to that. And I do remove the dither. Dan Worrell just did a great video about dithering. If you just search WTF is dithering on YouTube, you'll find it. He does a great job of explaining dither and whether or not we need it for MP3 encoding. I'm still in the habit of not dithering my MP3s, so they come from Floating Point. Anyways, I've removed the dither, and that's the only reason why I make a special montage, is so that I have a version without dither. And if I need to get back to my 16-bit version, and I could also render 16-bit waves. There's a preset for that, a render preset, 16-bit waves. It changes the output format to 16. I could just simply change the 24 to 16. And now I have a folder being created with 16-bit waves. You can use the Mac Finder to verify that it's 16-bit. But let's do the MP3s because those are fun with artwork. So this is the only time I go into the metadata tab. I hit metadata, edit, go to the picture tab and hit the plus sign. And I can grab the artwork that the client sent me. And you want to be careful here. Sometimes clients will send you a JPEG that's like 15 megabytes. WaveLab doesn't do any resizing of the artwork. It just puts it in there. So if you add a 15 megabyte graphic to an MP3, it's going to be huge and defeat the purpose. So this is actually a very small artwork file for some reason, but if your artwork, I found that if your artwork's under a megabyte, it's going to be fine. I've had issues with large artwork displaying in Windows Media Player. So I just like to make sure that the artwork isn't ridiculously huge file size. Anyways, I select the artwork and I can see that it's there and I press OK. And now when I render MP3s, there's a preset for that. Render preset, MP3 tracks. I do 320 kilobyte per second MP3s. And again, I want to change the folder name or make a new. Doing this will create a new folder if it doesn't exist. So I just rename the folder to that. And now I'm rendering MP3s. And as you can see, they're showing up. The metadata is there. The artwork's there. The other thing I like to do too is, because it's hard to get clients to use the DDP player these days, everyone's on mobile. Sometimes I'll do this. I'll go to 320 full ref, choose that render preset. That's going to do the whole montage. And I can use this drop-down menu to get some recently used names. It's really handy. So it's going to make an MP3 with this name _full in that same folder. Now I'm rendering a full MP3, and you could do a wave too, but this is a full MP3 of the record. That allows them to listen to it, on Dropbox or wherever without a media player and just listen to it in one pass. Whereas if you send them a link to a folder and they don't have a media player, they have to manually play each song. It's a headache. This just lets it go. It helps them verify the song spacings if they don't have access to a DDP player or media player. So this is typically what I'll send out. Not so much the 16 bits, but I'll kind of send out these 3 files, and whatever's best for the client to listen to is what they approve. So I don't want to go too much longer here, but that's basically how I render out all my formats. And then when the project is approved, let's say they say the project's approved. That's great. I'll still send them the 24-bit 96K waves. I can just reopen that version and I can see right here, this is the rendered one has a 24-bit dither happening. Press 24-bit and I can 2496 wave, and I can verify down here that is the 96K montage. Hit render, and now I have a folder populating of 96K waves. And again, all the data's there. So it's just, in my opinion, that's why I love WaveLab, is enter and sequence at once, get all your files. I do want to touch on vinyl masters, and I can touch into revisions too. If a client said, it's great, but can you make it a little louder? I'm sure you've all heard that. I did unfortunately clear my plugins for the sake of rendering speed, but what I would do in the case of a revision, it's a little cumbersome, but I think it's the best way. It's the only way. I would do save as, and I would just change this to version 2, because you always want to be able to get back to version 1, because you want to know what your settings were. And again, this is not making a new set of files. It's just making a new montage file, which is very small. So I change it to version 2, and then I make the needed changes. It could be a song spacing thing. It could be a level thing. It could be changing the song order. Sometimes you have to go change the song order. So you can go to clips and you can drag this one up. So now the songs are in that order. Again, you may want to restagger them however possible. It gets a little tricky sometimes. You got to play with it. Let's pretend it's great. Could be changing the song title. They change their mind. You would just change it. Maybe it's She Is Your Baby. So you would change it at the marker level. Then you do have to go into the CD text editor, and you can go to that song, and you can use just this little button to change it to She Is Your Baby. And now we have marker names and CD text in sync. You can also change it at the CD text level. Maybe it's Bleed Through You instead. If you change it in the CD text editor, you can just go to CD tab, Functions, rename CD tracks as CD text, and now watch the marker name change to Bleed Through You. So that's the way to, there's two ways to do it. You can go forwards or backwards, but you do want to change it in both places. So, if I need to make a revision, unfortunately, then I redo all those steps, but that's the only way to lock in all the processing, keep it cohesive, and hopefully you don't get a revision, but if you do, also, I know I mentioned it earlier, but in case people are skipping around, if you do get a new mix file, let's say they send you some new mixes for these 3 songs, put them in your project folder. They're already there, so it's kind of weird, but put them in your project folder. What's Problematic has a version 2, so you could go to that song and select it. A few ways to do it. In the Insert tab, we have Replace Audio File. There's some more advanced features here, but what I do is I just press Command R, and then I find the new mix version and pop it in. And it didn't look like much happened, but that's the new mix version. Sometimes you have to play around if the mix has a different starting point, if the mix engineer was a little sloppy with that. But basically, it gets the new file in there, and then all your clip effects still stay the same. Everything else stays the same. It's a really quick way to add in a new file. But let's talk about vinyl masters. So let's say that this project was approved, and now they need the vinyl master. What I would do is open up the master approved version. So this is the version with all the plugins. And I would do a save as. And I kind of wipe out this text and do vinyl. So I'm calling it 24-bit 96K vinyl pre-master, and version 2 was the approved. So this is how I name it, because we're going to do some tweaks here for vinyl. It's debatable what you do for vinyl. A lot of people will remove or ease up on the peak limiting. Might do more de-essing. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but typically we do some minor tweaks for vinyl so that it translates well. But the other thing we need to do is render a wave of each side of the record, and also produce a PDF file that matches those waves. So I'm not going to change the songs. Ooh, I hit the mic. I'm not going to change the song spacing, but I do need to verify some things. You want to verify that wherever side B starts, that there isn't a song overlap, because it's happened where songs 5 and 6 overlap, but that's also where the vinyl side splits. So you got to make sure there's a clean break, which there usually is. And again, this is a save as, so we're not ruining our master project, but it would have all the same clip effects that you probably want. Typically, I just clear out the final limiter in the inspector, and I have my own little vinyl starting point that I like to use in the montage output effects. But the thing I'm trying to show you here is how to differentiate side A and B, and we do that in the CD tab, and there's a group column, and you can click in the group column. You can go up to letter Z now. I've never used more than F, but obviously song 1 is going to be on side A, and when you select that, it puts all of them on side A, which is of course not ideal. But then what you do is you figure out where does side B start. I'm going to say that side B starts with this song, Brain in a Jar. So I'm going to choose, I'm going to go down to that song and choose side B for that group. And as you can see, it changes all the following tracks to side B. So that's really nice and quick to do when you're not trying to talk about it. You just side A, side B. So this is actually kind of lopsided. It's not really ideal for vinyl, but I'm just going with the flow here. So basically, I'm going to render a wave of each side, side A, side B. And in the past, it was annoying. You would have to make a separate montage for one for side A and one for side B, and started them both at 0 so that the PDF file would match the wave file. Because, if I render a wave of side B and make a PDF, if it said that song 1 started at 12 minutes and 45 seconds, that's not where it starts on the side B file. Side B starts at 0. So, and again, this is kind of shrunk down album and lopsided, but it'll get the point across. So I've determined the CD track groups. Side A is these songs, side B is these. I've done double and triple LPs the same way. You can have a lot of track groups. So assuming everything sounds how I want, we go back to the render tab. And this is a little simpler than the other formats. I just choose vinyl side A. And here's a little run through what it's doing. It's, instead of rendering the full montage, or instead of rendering CD tracks, it's rendering CD track groups. It's rendering CD track group A only. So basically side A. It's going to be a named file. It's going to be 24-bit. We'll pick the location, and we do have to give it a unique name because it's not going to pull from the track names anymore, because it has a lot of tracks in the file. The other options that it does is it does copy the markers. I know some cutting engineers that can see these markers embedded in the WAV file, and it may help them, but we can't assume that they're going to see these markers. So we also make a PDF that tells it where it is. But these are my options. But again, it's all covered by just pressing vinyl side A. It sets it how it needs to be. And I tend to just copy an existing. I like to stick with the naming theme for a project, whatever that may be. It has to do with the artist name, album title. So I'm sticking with this theme here. I didn't copy it apparently. Copy. So the album is artist name, album title, and I'm just going to call it. Actually, I don't even have to do anything. I just do that, and the rest of it's going to be handled with this stuff. Instead of rendering it to this folder, I'm going to call it the folder. I'm going to add vinyl to the folder name because it's going to be the vinyl pre-master. And I use the naming scheme. It's going to add side A to whatever I decided the name's going to be. So side A is going to get tacked on to this file name. So I'm all set, assuming it sounds good. I'm going to render that. And it's just rendered. And I have it so that it opens the file because I, of course, want to check these before I send it out for someone to cut them. Make sure there's no rendering problems and everything's correct. So that just rendered side A. And usually these take a little longer, so I do them both at the same time, and then they finish about the same time. But that went really fast. So then for side B, I just choose down here, vinyl side B. And I could use that shortcut pressing the letter Y. That would choose it. So now I'm going to render that. So now I have waves of side A and side B. And as you can see, there are markers embedded. If the cutting engineer's software can read those, then that's great. Then they know where the songs start. But if they can't, if they're flying blind, I also make PDF files. And this is also where WaveLab is great. So trying to think, because I use so many presets. CD report. So we go to the CD tab. So we use this little icon here to do a CD report. And it brings up this menu. And as you can imagine, I have a lot of presets already made. So vinyl 96K is where I'm at. And the reason I choose 96K is I leave a little note saying the audio is 24-bit, 96K, one file per album size. So one thing I did forget to do, of course, is you want to dither to 24-bit in your whatever effects you have going on. Of course, you want to dither last, have it be last in your chain. Here's one potential starting point. I have some stuff to help with vinyl, and then the last thing is the 24-bit dither. But my whole point here is, if you're using my shortcuts, you can use the letter P and then Q. You have to do it kind of in sequence. The letter P, letter Q brings up the audio CD report. This is handy if you're making DDPs to give them a little report, but it's also handy for the vinyl and cassettes, really. So there's a preset in here for vinyl 96K. Again, it has that note pre-programmed for the cutting engineer. And I also have one, of course, for 88.2 not a huge deal, but anyways, the things you really want to pay attention to here, it's all set, but this CD report is only going to be a report for track group A, which is not that big of a deal, but it becomes a big deal for track group B. So just be aware of the setting up here. All these are kind of dialed in for you. If you can pause my screen, or if you're grabbing my presets, you already have this. What's nice is that the location of the PDF is usually already set to go in the vinyl folder. I don't have to touch this. And this is the given name. I tend to prefer to give it that name, side A, so that it matches the WAV file exactly. So I can hit apply, and I have a CD report for side A. And because the text, in my opinion, is small, I'll make it obvious I'll edit this PDF in the preview app and just put side A. And then I will go to the top menu here and choose CD track group B. And I'll change the name of the PDF file to have a B so it matches the WAV file. Press apply. And I like to just make it obvious that this is... So now it does say group B in here if you zoom in, but such small text, I just like to augment it with my own little highlights. So now I have a PDF file, and the great thing here is it'll tell you how long side B is, how many tracks it has, and these marker times are, they make sense with the audio file that was rendered, not the montage, because if you remember, side B started at about 12 minutes, and you don't see any mention of that in here. It's song 2 is starting at, these are short songs. Song 2 starts at 1 minute and 40 seconds, so now the cutting engineer knows where that song starts, and they know how to make it visual band so that you know where to drop the needle. So important stuff for people that make a lot of vinyl masters. And again, this all goes really quickly, and then if you go to the actual folder, I screwed up somewhere. Where did I screw up? I think I screwed up when I did the rendering, perhaps. No, I screwed up when I did the PDF. So let's go back to the PDFs. That was somehow for a different project, but you can use this menu to select the right project. So let me start over. I've really done it. Side A. So I'm going to make, somehow I goofed something up, but I want to make this PDF file in the same folder as the vinyl files. Press A. Again, I like to add that. Change it to track group B. Same location. So I already went over what's on the PDFs, but I just wanted to show you that when you then go to the folder for vinyl, you have a wave of each side and a matching PDF, and that's what the cutting engineers usually want. Of course, you can zip it up, send it off. So you can do the same thing for cassettes. Usually cassettes need to be still 16-bit 44.1 because that's what the main cassette manufacturer has a limitation of, but there's render settings, render presets for cassette, and all this stuff in the render presets. I know this is getting very long. I don't even know if anyone's watching, but now that I know how to live stream, I may do my workflow for single songs. It's basically the same. I know we do a lot of singles now. I still use the montage for singles because I just really like that environment, and it makes the metadata and everything just easier. So even if I'm doing a single song, I don't use the audio editor. I use the montage for all those reasons. And I even do the full render, even though it's one song. I still do the full render to lock in the processing at 96K or the highest sample rate. The only difference is, let me see if I have something I can open. Yeah, so I did a... this is a single I did for somebody. The only difference is how I name the files. So I'm actually going to delete them so I don't get errors. So, you know, this was my main montage. Let's see what it looks like. So this is the montage with all the effects. As you can see, I added a few things. This was my 96K. This is how I printed it after limiting and everything. This is what goes out. I have some render presets for single song mastering. This one, and you can do this by pressing just the number 9, which is great. So I can just open this, press 9. This creates a 24-bit wave with the suffix of 2496. Because again, there's no track number to worry about with singles, but we do care about format sometimes. So this allows me to render a 2496 wave. And then I use the custom montage duplicate, but in the interest of speed, since I've already done that, so then I can do that with, convert it externally to 48K. I have a montage preset that, among other things, adds the 2448 suffix. So when I render that 48K version, it ends with 2496. So you know what the sample rate and bit depth are. All this stuff. So even I have one for, and you can just press the letter N. That happened to be that preset. So I'm working a little bit backwards here, but you get the point here. You can really quickly, with the render presets and the naming scheme, you can get things done really quickly. Of course, add the artwork. There's the artwork, and now I've got, for the MP3 single preset, I don't add a suffix because it's just the MP3, but now we got all the stuff and everything's dialed in. So I think I'm going to have to leave it there. Went kind of long. I'm definitely going to do one with analog gear and some more advanced stuff, but that's just a basic way of how to get things in and out and all the things. I hope I covered everything. I'm going to try to see if anyone's even watching, if there's anything I can touch on. And also, there is a WaveLab users group on Facebook, and I'm on there every day. So if you have any questions that I wasn't able to get to, just search on Facebook for the WaveLab users group. You can ask some questions there. I'm sure we'll do a little follow-up thread to all this stuff, later this week or later today. But I think that's everything. I'm having a hard time reading all the comments and talking at the same time. So I'm just going to call it a day, get some lunch, and thanks for watching. Hopefully you learned something about WaveLab, about how to make an easier workflow. Again, it's by far my favorite mastering software. It's on Mac and PC. WaveLab 10 has the reference tracks and the better ability to route to your analog equipment, and that is, I'm gonna leave it at that. So I'm going to end the live stream. Check out the WaveLab user group to ask some more direct questions, and we'll do another one of these streams maybe in a week or two to cover some other topics.